Hello guys, sorry about the sudden ghosting, got caught up with life, but anyway, I will start to post a whole lot more anyway. Make sure to like and subscribe. Besides that, enjoy chapter 61. Nightmares in the fight. Of course, after every good day, the brothers always have to have a bad one. Even though they had all gone to sleep happier than they had been in a long time, the same couldn't be said about the way they woke up. Sabo was stuck in a nightmare, and it wasn't a good one either apparently. Even though 13 minutes had passed since the blonde had woken Ace and Luffy, they were having no luck in waking their brother up, no matter how hard they tried. They didn't have Sabo's great sense of hearing, so they had no clue if breakfast was ready or not, or even if breakfast was being made yet. They had no sense of whether the crew was worrying if they would show up, or if the crew was even awake yet. Without Sabo, their knowledge of everyone outside their door was unknown to them, and that was a bit terrifying to them, especially seeing as this was something they did not need someone just wandering into unexpectedly. Sabo, calm down, it's morning, we're on the Moby Dick, we're with the Whitebeard Pirates, we're out of that shitty place. Ace said in as soothing a voice he could manage with how anxious he was getting. Luffy sat beside the blonde, holding his sleeping brother's hand in his own as he watched with worry, stretching out his haki as best he could to make sure no one was heading their way, using his sense of smell to help as well. It wasn't as good as Sabo, but it would help for the time being. SSH, it's okay, it's just a nightmare. Ace soothed as Sabo thrashed a bit. Ace and Sabo got stuck in their nightmares much more sparingly than Luffy, but when they did get stuck, they were normally pretty bad nightmares. Come on, you can do it, just wake up and you'll see that everything's fine now. Ace encouraged, hoping that his brother would just open his eyes. Another few minutes of coaxing the blonde passed, but they weren't without reward. After the 17th minute of Sabo being stuck, he finally woke up, springing up in the bed and gasping loudly, as if he had been deprived of air until then. His eyes were wide as he heaved, chest rising and falling quickly as he tried to catch his breath. Luffy rubbed Sabo's back quietly, while Ace continued to do his best to soothe the blonde, whispering quiet reassuring words to him, in hopes of calming him down some more. Another minute passed before Sabo got a hold of himself, sitting up straighter as he looked at his brothers. Briefly, he noticed their tattoos, looking to his own and finding comfort in it. It was definitive proof that they weren't back in the facility. No words were spoken because honestly, none needed to be. This had happened to them before, and it would no doubt happen again. It was routine, just something they'd all come to terms with, so when they got up and got ready for the day, nothing needed to be said about what had happened. If they ever wanted to talk about their nightmares, they could, and they all knew that. There was no need for words. Breakfast only just started. How long was I stuck? Sabo asked in a slightly more groggy than usual voice. 17 minutes, Luffy said, having been in charge of keeping count. Sabo nodded, getting dressed quickly along with his brothers before they left their room. Like Ace and Luffy had guessed, Sabo had had a particularly unpleasant nightmare, and it hadn't left him in the best of moods. Everyone at breakfast seemed to take notice of this, realizing that where Sabo usually wore a pleasant smile, he wore a frown as he glared at his food, pushing it around on his plate. Luffy and Ace looked just fine however, if a bit more guarded than they normally were. Sabo ate his food eventually, maybe a bit slower than normal, so the commanders and Whitebeard decided not to ask, figuring Ace and Luffy had the issue covered. For all they knew, it was something the blonde wouldn't want to talk about in the first place, at least, not with them. They understood that, even though the brothers had revealed their dark past to them, that didn't mean they were going to tell them everything about themselves. That was something they would have to earn with time and trust. So when the brothers left the galley, the commanders watched them go silently. As time passed, it seemed to be the right decision, because shortly after breakfast, Sabo was smiling again, as if he hadn't been grumpy this morning. They chalked it off to a bad night's sleep and it was left at that. The brothers did their chores, finishing before lunch again, and were now sitting in their usual spot. Sabo had gotten over his nightmare a bit easier than he usually did. Normally after a nightmare, the brothers would be bothered by it for the rest of the day, or at least up until dinner, but he'd gotten over his in record time. Maybe it was because of all the distractions on the Moby, maybe it was because Luffy was so blindingly happy that particular day, or maybe it was even because Sabo had enjoyed Thatch's cooking much more than usual. Whatever it was, Sabo didn't mind as he sat with Luffy, picking out clouds that they found to look a particular shape or animal. Time passed peacefully, slowly. A few crew members that they didn't quite know the names of yet came up and said hi, some introducing themselves before leaving, and the brothers allowed it. It was a change that many on board noticed. Once upon a time, the brothers had kept anyone that attempted conversation away with a glare or even just ignoring them, but now they were allowing people to not only walk up to them, but have small conversations. Some were still a bit cautious about the whole change, not quite sure if they were allowed to walk up and talk, but once they saw the first one do it, they all decided it was alright. Not everyone on deck knew about their past or even their abilities, but they did know that they were part of the crew now, and they chalked it up to the brothers opening up to their new crew members. Ace, Sabo said, calling his brother. It was one of the brief times that no one was bothering the brothers, and now that the noise around them had quieted slightly, Sabo swore he could hear something. Ace peeked an eye open in confusion, looking up at Sabo, wondering what he wanted. Do you see anything over there? Sabo asked, pointing off in a seemingly random direction. The brothers were sitting close enough to Whitebeard and a few commanders next to him that they heard the conversation, and they watched with interest as Ace stood up. Leaning on the railing as he looked in the direction his brother pointed to. Ah, yeah, there's a ship over there, Ace said, easily picking out the ship out of the vast blue sea. The commanders raised their eyebrows at that, Marco coming over. Do you see what kind of ship it is, Yuri? Marco asked, curious. Ace was silent for a second, scanning the sails for any indication on who could be commanding the ship. Ma'am, looks pretty plain. I think it's a pirate ship. It's got a Jolly Roger, Ace said, noticing the black flag with the skull on it. Can you see what it looks like? Haruta asked. He and Izo, along with Blenheim and Akrios, stood beside Whitebeard, listening closely. It's a skull with roses for eyes and vines around the skull instead of crossbones, Ace described. Is it heading towards us? Blenheim asked, looking out at the ocean and trying to see what Ace was seeing. Of course, he saw nothing, not even a speck. Yup, Ace answered easily. How many people? Sabo asked, curious himself. 100, maybe 125 actually. Not counting however many are inside, Ace said, leaning away from the rail and looking to Marco who nodded, taking in the information. The first mate turned to Whitebeard who grinned. We'll see if they want to fight. For now, warn everyone that there's an unknown pirate ship heading our way, Whitebeard said. Marco nodded at the order and began shouting orders to the crew that had been oblivious to what was happening. The brothers watched as the commanders came out on deck just in case, even Thatch who had been in the middle of cooking lunch. How did you know they were pirates? Thatch asked, squinting as he tried making out the tiny dot that was now visible to them. I heard them so I asked Ace if there was anything over there. Pirates are particularly loud, you know, Sabo said, still listening to the crew that was off in the distance. You could see that far away? Fossa asked, amazed. Ace nodded, doing his best to not say I told you so. Well yeah, we did tell you that, he opted for, shrugging as if it was no big deal, and technically, it wasn't I told you so, it was we told you so. Can you hear what they're saying right now? Izo asked Sabo. Yeah, they were a bit too far away before, but they're getting clearer the closer they get. I think they're getting themselves riled up, Sabo said, hearing one of the rival pirates talking in a loud, motivating voice, the crew cheering in response. Sounds like a fight to me, Jozu said with a grin. We'll only attack if they do so first, Whitebeard said though he was still smiling. Nah, can we fight too then? Luffy asked, turning to look at the captain with a grin. All three of the brothers were still itching to fight, and even though they were outed about their powers, Ace and Luffy still hadn't had reason to use them yet, meaning they were still aching too. We don't know how well you three can fight, so if you stay near Marco it should be fine, Whitebeard said, not wanting the brothers to get hurt if it could be helped. Yosh. Did you hear that, Ace? Sabo. We get to fight too. Luffy cheered happily, the crew watching the youngest with an amused expression. Those who weren't commanders didn't know that they could fight, so they were a little confused but trusted their Oyaji. We did, Lu. Hopefully, they're better fighters than that idiot Dekken was. Ace grumbled. You're still hung up on that. Geez, talk about holding grudges. Sabo teased, rolling his eyes. Ace glared at him, pouting as he crossed his arms over his chest. You and Luffy at least got to fight more than one idiot who talked too much, Ace retorted, though it wasn't much of a comeback. Sabo and Luffy laughed at that before noticing that the ship was growing ever so slowly closer. Last-minute preparations were made now that others could clearly see the Jolly Roger. A few went around, making sure everyone who needed them had weapons, while those in the crow's nests made their way down. The crew chatted amongst themselves for a while until the ship was finally close enough to communicate with. It was apparent rather quickly that this was an enemy ship. Weapons were drawn on the rival pirate ship, all of them looking ready to jump onto the Moby, despite the fact that their ship was significantly smaller than it. Whitebeard, we're here to take your head once and for all. They assumed it was the captain that shouted the words, but it was unclear as someone placed planks down, and they were soon being boarded, the enemy pirates quickly making their way over. From then on, the fight began. As promised, the brothers were allowed to fight, and when the first person tried to attack them, that's what they did. They made sure that Marco was close by before attacking, and once they did, they fell back into the easy rhythm they'd always had when fighting with each other. Ace easily dodged a swipe from his sword, even though it wouldn't have harmed him, and used his momentum to swing his leg out and kick the man in the side, sending him flying over to the railing. Beside him, Luffy used a man's body as a springboard, pushing off the man's shoulders and using his newfound height to swing his fist into another rival pirate's face. Sabo easily knocked the man Luffy had used as a springboard to the floor, sweeping his legs out from under him. The fight was a much-needed warm-up for the brothers, one they hadn't had in a long time. Even though they did a lot of fighting in the facility, none of it was enjoyable. It was all forced upon them, and it was always against people who couldn't even defend themselves. Now, though, it was something that they could lose themselves in. These rival pirates had attacked them first. This was something they should have known was going to happen, and these people were those who could defend themselves, though they were doing so rather poorly. This was a fight that the brothers had been waiting for. Hagen. Ace's call of his attack was heard amongst his brothers as Ace squatted a bit, turning his fingers into guns, and shooting fire bullets out at their opponents. Without missing a beat, Luffy ran towards those who survived the initial attack, jumping into the air once more and throwing his fists back. No Gatling. Rapidly, Luffy's fists attacked all those who had still been standing, sending them crashing into the railing, or even into the sea. Sabo watched his brothers' backs, easily blocking and returning punches with quick succession. It was quite obvious to both parties that the Whitebeard pirates were the victors of this fight far before it was even over. After punching a few more pirates, the brothers watched as the rivals evacuated the Moby, returning to their ship with their tails between their legs, and sailing off as the Whitebeards cheered in victory. Luffy grinned widely, teeth showing as he stretched his arms in the air. That felt good. Luffy exclaimed happily, letting his arms stretch slightly longer than a normal human's arms stretch. No kidding, I feel like I haven't used my fire in ages. Ace agreed, watching his fire dance across his fingertips. The crew members who didn't know about the brothers' abilities watched in both shock and amazement as they showed off both their fighting abilities as well as their devil fruits. You guys are pretty good fighters. Vista complimented from where he stood, not too far off. Sabo smiled at him. Thank you, as we said, we've had a lot of practice, Sabo said, ignoring the twinge of guilt as he remembered just who they had practiced against. You can definitely hold your own, that's for sure, Curiel said, the others nodding their agreement. Luffy continued beaming at the praise, basking in the feelings that came from the commanders. A few more words of praise were said, along with a few questions about their abilities, before the lunch bell rang, and the crew began making their way inside to eat. As they all made their way inside, there was the distinct sound of someone slipping and falling onto the floor with a loud thud, the chatter quieting down, as everyone turned to see what had happened. The brothers, who were at the back of the crowd, easily saw that on one of the stairs leading down from the top deck, Marco had tripped on something, and he looked to be fuming about it. Everyone watched as the first commander glared at something on the ground before looking to the galley doors that the crowd was half in and half out of. Thatch, I swear, this is not happening again. Come get your damn fishing poles off these stairs or so help me you will not have hair by dinner. Everyone watched in shocked amusement as the pompadoured chef came bursting through the crowd, a panicked look on his face as he began screaming apologies. Sorry. It's just, there was lunch to make, and then the pirate attack, and then Harita was telling me this weird story about frogs, and then lunch was ready, and... Thatch, I could really care less about that, just pick your damn poles up and put them away, Yuri. Everyone began laughing, the brothers included, after finding out what had happened, all of them returning to their previous task of getting food. Off in the distance, Sabo could hear Haruta cursing softly to himself, and few commanders pouting as well, no doubt having tried to get the bet of making Thatch forget his poles up and running again. After all, it had gone on a pretty long while the last time they did it, but then Marco began to catch on to them, and they had to end the bet prematurely. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy all smiled to themselves as they made their way to their normal seats. Thatch, who had quickly returned his fishing poles to their proper place, was rushing back into the galley. Running into the kitchen and returning with food that he quickly served the brothers in Whitebeard with a smile. The trio watched everything with a fondness in their eyes, all of them thinking the exact same thing. Even though it had been slow going, even though they hadn't trusted these pirates at all for a long while, they knew things were changing. Change could be scary, and it had been, it still was, but they were determined to see this change through to the end, and so far their expectations had been exceeded greatly. They had thought that they would have a much more difficult time here with the Whitebeard pirates, but they were constantly being proved wrong. With the way things were going now, the brothers would be comfortable with this crew in no time. They thought it would be tough for them on this crew, but if this was how every day on the Moby Dick would be, then they would get by just fine. Chapter 62. The news is out. Look at this, Luffy said to his brothers. Sabo was sitting on the railing beside Luffy while Ace was leaning against the railing, deciding not to pretend to be sleeping today. The two looked over to Luffy, curious as to what he could be doing. They had finished breakfast, as well as their chores, so they were just killing time until lunch or something else entertaining happened. Look at what? Ace asked after Luffy didn't do anything. This? Luffy said, nodding his head towards his hands. He was interlocking his fingers, but Ace and Sabo couldn't quite figure out what that was supposed to mean. Sabo was about to question it when, with his tongue peeking out in concentration, Luffy stretched his fingers out, making an almost net-like structure with his rubber body. That's pretty cool, Sabo said honestly, watching Luffy stretch his fingers out wide before returning them back to their usual size. Do you think he could catch fish with that? Ace joked, Luffy looking as if he was seriously contemplating trying that. Honestly, he probably could, but let's not attempt that right now please. I'd rather not have to jump in and save you if you fell in, Sabo said with a sigh, knowing that, with their luck, that's exactly what would happen. Luffy pouted but didn't try it, instead sitting in silence once more with his brothers. Time passed and the brothers continued having a quiet conversation amongst themselves, Luffy trying new ways to stretch his body, while Ace let his fire dance in the palm of his hand. After so long with the two not being able to use their fruit powers, it felt amazing to let go, to use their abilities in the open. In the middle of doing this, Ace, who was still leaning against the railing and looking at the ocean, squinted slightly, looking off in the distance. Are we getting close to an island? Ace asked out loud, knowing it was a stupid question to ask. After all, he could see the island right there, so of course, they were getting close, but he knew that Sabo and Luffy couldn't see it. And he knew that the Whitebeards probably couldn't even see it through their telescopes yet, so really, it was a reasonable question to ask. Yeah, why? Izo asked, coming to stand beside Ace. The commander hadn't been all that far away from the brothers, so when Ace asked the question, he had been close enough to hear it. I'm pretty sure that's what I'm seeing over there, Ace said, nodding his head to the island off in the distance. Oh, really, what's it look like? Is it big? Come on Ace, tell me. Luffy chirped happily, always wanting the details of the islands that they were getting close to. Yeah, don't worry Lou, I'll tell you, Ace said before launching into a detailed description of the island that they were approaching. Izo listened curiously because it was fascinating to him that someone could be given such an incredible gift such as Ace's. It seemed like something that could only happen thanks to a devil fruit, but here he was, living proof that something impossible like this could be real. Of course, it hadn't happened miraculously, it hadn't happened without sacrifice, and that was something Izo had to remind himself of. Even though the brothers all had amazing gifts, they had been given them forcefully and painfully. The call above them cued them in on the fact that the news crew had arrived, and Izo waved his hand in the air, buying himself a copy of the newspaper. A few of his ship brothers did the same, all of them buying their own copy as well. Normally Izo would flip through the news, taking everything that was printed with a grain of salt, because the Marines were known for controlling the media to turn everything into something that made them look righteous, and make their opposers look dastardly. Of course, there was always the off chance that there was something good in the paper, like updated bounties or reports of new rookies, and that seemed to be the case for today's news as well, because right on the front page, in bold lettering that caught his attention, was something that interested him. Oh? Izo asked, more to himself, as he skimmed through the article. Both his anger and his amazement at the Marine's audacity made Izo scoff unpleasantly as he finished reading the article, only just noticing that Sabo was giving him a curious look. Something the matter? Sabo asked, catching Luffy and Ace's attention as well, Ace stopping in his description of the island, as he turned to look at the commander. Interesting is more like it, Yoi, Marco spoke up as he handed his own newspaper to Whitebeard, who read the article with a raised eyebrow. Ace frowned at that, also becoming curious. What is it? The eldest asked, wishing he had a paper of his own to read. See for yourself, Izo said, handing over his paper to Sabo, who only needed to glance at the front page to see what they were talking about. Trio from Hell. A report from the Marines headquarters in Marineford has just informed us that there are 3 new villains out there that we should all be worried about. About a month ago now, there was a breakout on the usually peaceful island of Trinitary. Reports indicate that there was a mental hospital for delinquent and violent children, as well as children with mental disorders on the island, which was subsequently destroyed when 3 teenagers from the facility broke out, freeing all of the children that were being held inside. The 3 that destroyed the facility reportedly went into a fit of rage, attacking those who were attempting to feed them, and they ran out, attacking and defeating every guard that stood in their path, while also freeing all the other children as well. You may have become aware of the Marines' hunt for children with numbers tattooed on their wrists, and you would be correct in assuming those very children are the ones that have escaped. If you see a child with a number on their wrist, it is advised that you keep your distance and call any nearby Marines, so they can detain them safely. All of these children are suspected to be highly dangerous, so do not attempt to make contact with them if you see them. The 3 that caused all of this have the numbers 11,062, 11,085, and 11,097. It is reported that 11,062 has the ability to control fire, and 11,097 has a rubber body, both due to devil fruits that they possess. These 3 are the most dangerous, and if seen, it is expected that you contact the Marines immediately. The Marines thank you all for your cooperation as they tried their best to resolve this matter and get the children the help they desperately need. If anyone has any information on where these children could be, especially the trio that caused this, there is a reward out. Marines will be doing sweeps on all of the Blue Seas islands, in hopes of finding and returning as many children as they can, and hope to stretch their searches into the Grand Line, and hopefully into the New World as well. We hope justice will prevail and no one gets hurt by these dangerous children. Beside the words, there were pictures of the destroyed facility, but none of the pictures went further than the first floor, of course, because that's where everyone would have seen the cells and labs. Of course that's the story those damn Marines would come up with, Ace said, glaring at the words on the page. He and Luffy were reading over Sabo's shoulder, all three of them amazed at how the Marines had managed to spin the story into something that made the brothers look bad, and made the Marines look like godsends, regardless of the fact that it was almost completely the other way around. Looks like we'll have to be even more cautious on islands now too, now that everyone knows our numbers and some of our powers, Sabo said with a sigh, looking up and towards where he knew the island was getting closer. Can't believe it took them over a month to come up with this though, Ace muttered, not even looking at the paper anymore. They probably thought they could get us all back before anyone got too suspicious of their searches, Sabo said, flipping through the paper a bit more before some pages fell out, the blonde quickly grabbing them before they could fall to the water. What are those? Luffy asked curiously, peering over Sabo's shoulder in an attempt to see them better. Bounties, Ace said simply, recognizing the paper for what it was. There were 3 pages, each with one of the brothers' numbers on it, but there was no picture with them, just their number, the words, wanted. Alive only, and their bounties, which were each 100 million. There was a whistle as Jiro came up, also holding a stack of similar posters. That's some starting bounty, he said, a few of the commanders that were out nodding their agreement. Yeah, it looks like they really want you guys back. It's not every day you see a starting bounty that high. They even put your status as alive only, Haruta noted. None of the other children that had been at the facility had posters, but the brothers chalked that up to both the fact that there were so many of them, as well as the fact that the rest of the children didn't have the same information about the facility like the brothers did. It was to be expected, Sabo said honestly with a sigh, handing both the posters and the newspaper back to Aizo who returned to reading the rest of the paper. There were whispers amongst the rest of the crew that didn't know the brothers' entire past, some of them wondering if what the Marines wrote about the brothers was true. But once Whitebeard and Marco heard these doubts, they had all the commanders inform their divisions that what the papers wrote was false, and that there was no need to worry about the brothers turning into vicious monsters. It was a bit disheartening to them that, after all this time of trying to get comfortable here, the Marines were still doing their best to keep the brothers from having any semblance of a normal life. They would never be able to walk around islands without the fear of someone seeing their number always looming over their heads. People would always see them as the trio from hell that defeated numerous armed guards, and were a threat to humanity as they knew it. It made the brothers mad, that was for sure, but there was nothing they could do about it now. They had been dealt their hand, and now they just had to be careful how they played their cards. The island that Ace had seen around a half hour ago was now close enough to the pirates that they were getting ready to disembark. Ace had gone to get their wristbands while Sabo and Luffy stood nearby Marco as they waited. They would be going with the first commander to the island like usual, and now that everyone on the planet knew about them, they were a bit tenser than they usually would be, fear that someone would see their numbers feeding into their anxieties. Here. Ace's simple word caught their attention as the eldest tossed Sabo and Luffy their wristbands, his own already around his wrist, perfectly covering the dreaded number. Sabo thanked him, slipping his own on, double-checking that it covered his number, before triple-checking that Luffy's was covering his number as well. Whitebeard's booming voice was heard soon after that, the captain giving instructions to some of the divisions on things they needed to go get, while telling others that they were free to explore and enjoy themselves. When he was finished, the brothers and Marco were about to leave when Thatch ran up to them. Hey, guys. Thatch said happily, smiling as he made his way over to them. Hi Thatch. Luffy chirped back happily, waving to the chef. Hello, there Thatch, what's up? Sabo asked, wondering what the man wanted. Oh, well I was wondering if I could come with you guys. The restocking that I normally do was passed on to a different group in my division, so I'm free to roam around, and I thought it'd be more fun to hang out with you guys, even if you do have old man Grumpy Pants with you. Thatch said, teasing the 1st Division commander, which quickly earned him a glare. The brothers smiled, Ace and Luffy laughing at the comment, while Sabo nodded. Sure, we're just going to look around though, Sabo said, knowing that most didn't find that all that exciting. As much as the brothers wanted to go charging into an adventure, they also knew that they couldn't risk that, not when news about them was just released that morning. Sounds good to me, Thatch said happily, leading the way off the ship, Marco rolling his eyes and muttering about annoying chefs. This only made the brothers smile more as they followed the man. Thatch was someone that, for a while now, they knew they could trust. He had done so much to help them, including helping them escape, so it was no surprise to them that they felt so comfortable around the man. Luffy watched the happy chef walk in front of them, talking to them about his previous experiences on this island, and Luffy could feel all the same happy emotions that Thatch always exuded. Not once had Luffy ever felt the man get mad towards them, not once had he felt any malicious feelings in the chef. Every time Luffy saw him he was always smiling, cheerful. Thatch had been one of the first people he'd seen after escaping the facility. Thatch was the one to calm Luffy down, the first one to make and keep a promise. Thatch made sure they were safe on Sabati, and he also made them all amazing food. Trusting him was almost as easy as eating to Luffy, so as they continued walking down the path towards the town, Luffy had no problem in following close behind Thatch, listening to his every word. Ace and Sabo felt the same way as they walked beside Luffy, not even bothering to keep tabs on the chef anymore as they walked. Marco and Thatch were both people that the brothers knew wouldn't try to hurt them. They had proven time and time again that they would instead help the brothers, rather than let them get hurt or caught. The walk through the town was pleasant, and despite the fact that only a half hour ago the brothers found out that the whole world was now looking for them, they were relatively at peace. They knew they could handle their own. It was just an added bonus that they were now with Thatch and Marco, who they knew was much stronger than them. That didn't mean they were any less cautious than they normally were though. If anything, thanks to the newspaper, they were more cautious. Window shopping was done calmly like they did on every island, and they even went into a few stores when Thatch would see something interesting. At one point they passed by a weapons shop, and Thatch ushered them in, mentioning something about a crew member's birthday coming up as he disappeared behind shelves in search of whatever it was he was looking for. "Ooh, Ace, Sabo, look at that," Luffy said enthusiastically, grabbing his brother's hands and pulling them over to a display of swords. Marco strolled lazily behind them, looking at the sword that Luffy was pointing at. "It's all shiny. And it's got jewels on it too," Luffy said in amazement, looking at the particularly sparkly sword. The boy was right, the sword was covered in shiny jewels along its hilt, looking like it would be uncomfortable to even hold. Ace raised an eyebrow at the weapon. "Who would want a sword like that?" Ace asked Sabo and Marco, finding themselves agreeing with the fire user. "Because it looks cool. Too bad I don't know how to use the sword though," Luffy said, a bit bummed that he wouldn't have a reason to use the sword. Sabo chuckled, placing a hand on Luffy's shoulder. "I think it's a good thing for everyone that you don't know how to. I'm sure you would manage to get into a lot more trouble if you did," Sabo said, he and Ace shuddering at the thought of Luffy with a sword. Luffy pouted for only a second more before moving on to another even more interesting looking mace, dragging the group with him. Thatch finally found whatever it was he was looking for, paying for it and rejoining the group, as Luffy examined a bow staff with intricate carvings etched into it. Ace stood beside him, looking at a set of daggers, and Sabo was a bit away, looking at halberds that were lined up on the wall. Marco stood with Luffy, noticing that the kid had a tendency to take off without a word, and decided it was best if he just stayed close to him. "Alright, I've got it," Thatch announced, holding up a bag with something in it. The brothers nodded, moving to join Thatch as they left the store, but as they were, Sabo's eye caught something sitting in the corner. "Hold on," Sabo said, already heading towards the weapon that caught his eye. Ace and Luffy watched curiously, following the blonde, while Thatch and Marco decided to wait by the door. When the brothers saw what had caught Sabo's eye, they grinned. "Are you gonna get it?" Ace asked, examining the shiny steel. Sabo tilted his head as he thought. "I think so. After all, I don't have you and Luffy's monster powers." Sabo teased, knowing that, of the three, Sabo had been given significantly less deadly abilities compared to his brothers. Luffy snickered while Ace grinned. Sabo grabbed a weapon and went to the counter to pay for it, his brothers once again following as they chatted amongst themselves. Once purchased, Sabo returned to Marco and Thatch, smiling. "The pipe, Yuri?" Marco asked curiously, looking at the weapon that was strapped on Sabo's back, thanks to another purchase the blonde had made. "Yup. We used to fight with them when we were younger. It's been a while, but after a bit of practice I'm pretty sure I'll be able to fight with it again," Sabo said, taking the weapon off his back and tossing it between hands, adjusting to its weight. He hadn't held a pipe in a long time, and to be holding one now was admittedly a bit nostalgic. "That's cool. I don't think I've ever seen someone fight with a pipe before," Thatch said with a smile as the group left the store. "Maybe we can spar later," Luffy chirped happily, remembering their old sparring tradition of 100 fights a day. "That would be fun." Ace agreed, Sabo also nodding his agreement as the group continued heading back to the Mobi. As they walked, a small conversation was made, until they were finally back to the ship, and they headed their separate ways, Thatch to his room, Marco to Whitebeard, and the brothers back to their room as well. Even though the whole world was after them, they had a feeling everything would be just fine as long as they were with the Whitebeards. Chapter 63. A nice peaceful day. The brothers did end up sparring before the day was over. It was only a few rounds, nothing like how they used to, but it was enough for them to brush up on their skills. Sabo was a bit rusty with the pipe at first, which was to be expected, but within a few rounds he was just as good, if not better, than he used to be way back when. "Ah. Damn it, that pipe of yours hurts," Ace whined as he rubbed his head, a scowl on his face. "Sorry, you big baby. If I'd have known you'd cry so much, I would have stuck to fighting Luffy," Sabo said with an eye roll, ducking underneath one of Luffy's kicks and immediately swinging his pipe into Luffy's back, knocking the youngest onto the ground. "That's another win for me, Lou," Sabo noted before Ace could say anything. "Aw. Again?" Luffy pouted as he shot back up to his feet, ready to go. Deciding to indulge him, Sabo crouched again with a smile, Luffy cheering as he saw this. I am not a baby, Ace muttered quietly to himself, knowing that Sabo and Luffy were too caught up in their spar to pay him any more attention. Huffing, Ace crossed his arms and rested against a tree, watching his brothers. Luffy was as quick and nimble as ever, ducking under Sabo's pipe and flipping through the air without problem. The blonde, however, was still stronger and smarter than Luffy, and when his brother was still flipping through the air, he hit his pipe onto Luffy's side, flinging him back to the ground and ending another match in record time. Again, Luffy cried. Both Ace and Sabo smiled at the word. When the brothers finally finished sparring amongst each other, Sabo and Ace fighting a few more times before ending with one big free-for-all, it was nearly dark. The brothers lounged around for the rest of the evening before heading to the Mobi and going to bed. Sure, the newspaper about them was a bit annoying and infuriating, but it was nothing they weren't used to by now. Their lives were always being controlled by others from the day they were born, so why would it be any different now? As the sun started rising and breakfast started being made the next day, the brothers found themselves waking up feeling much more optimistic than they had been in a long time. Sure, they had been given a pretty shitty life so far, but it was up to them to make their lives better from here on out. They weren't going to let anyone control them any longer. Breakfast, Sabo said with a yawn and a stretch as he forced himself out of the bed, Ace and Luffy following without complaint, the two of them also stretching. After getting their tattoos, Ace hadn't been wearing a shirt, and today was no different. Luffy was wearing a vest that he left open to show off the tattoo, and Sabo had been wearing more sleeveless shirts as well. He knew that, once his tattoo was healed up enough, he would start wearing long sleeves again. It was what he was used to, what he was comfortable with. Besides, he wasn't a big fan of showing all the scars on his arms, only reminding him of everything that had happened. Ma'am, do you think Thatch made muffins again? Luffy asked, lazily sniffing the air for any hint of the smell. Dunno, let's go find out. Ace muttered back, yawning again as they double-checked to make sure they were awake enough to leave the room, not wanting their senses to get overwhelmed. When they deemed themselves awake, they left the room, Luffy beginning to chatter about all the food he could smell, one of those being the muffins. I really like the chocolate chip ones. Oh, but there's also the blueberry ones, those are pretty good too. Luffy said cheerfully, in a good mood this morning. What about the banana nut ones? Sabo asked with a smile, already knowing the answer. Oh? Those ones too? Luffy said as he looked over to Sabo with a smile. Or the cranberry nut muffins, Ace added, which made Luffy swivel his head to look at him now, still smiling. Yeah? They're all so good. Luffy said, drool starting to pile up. Ace and Sabo laughed at the sight as they walked into the galley. All the smells hit the two older brothers at once, and made their own mouths begin to drool, the thought and smell of food, making their stomachs growl. Good morning you two. Izo greeted as they sat at the usual table. Sabo and Luffy smiled back while Ace opted to nod in Izo's direction, keeping his normal glare off of his face for the time being. Good morning Izo, how are you this morning? Sabo asked as a few more people filtered into the room, all looking groggy and hungry. I'm doing well, thanks for asking. I'm assuming you three are heading to the island again today. Izo said with a smile, nodding his head to their wrists, which were wearing the band that he had made for them. We are. We were planning on leaving after we finished up with our chores for the day. Sabo said, noticing Thatch coming out of the kitchen with their food. Most of the commanders were still absent, even the captain himself, but that wasn't unusual. The brothers had shown up a bit earlier than usual. Do you mind if I join? I haven't been out yet, I was planning to later. Izo said, turning to his own meal that he had in front of him as Luffy and Ace started digging in. Yeah, you can come. Luffy said happily, smiling widely to the man. He had been meaning to hang out with the crossdresser, wanting to know if he was someone that they could trust like Whitebeard, Marco and Thatch. Ace and Sabo looked to Luffy before shrugging, assuming their brother knew what he was doing. Izo looked mildly surprised before he smiled as well. In that case, I can't wait. I'll see you three then. He said, finishing up his food which had nearly been finished when the brothers got there. They said their goodbyes and the brothers continued to eat in peace. The rest of the commanders and Whitebeard slowly made their way in the galley during their meal. They had a bit of conversation with them, Marco saying he would join them again today, while Thatch lamented over the fact that he wouldn't be able to. The morning passed quickly as the brothers finished their food and went on to their chores, finishing them within record time. Can we go to the island now? Luffy asked excitedly, bouncing in place as he looked up at Sabo. We can, first we have to go get Izo and Marco, Sabo said, ruffling Luffy's hair. Yay. Izo, Marco, come on. Luffy shouted, some of the crew turning to look at the youngest with smiles, amused by the boy's excitement. Ace and Sabo shook their heads but followed Luffy, who used his nose to find the two commanders, finding them on the upper deck talking to each other. Izo, Marco, we're ready to go to the island now. Luffy said, earning smiles from the commanders as they nodded. Then we should get going then, huh? Izo asked. Yeah, come on. Luffy cheered, leading the way off the boat. He seems to be in a good mood today, Yoi, Marco noted as they all followed Luffy off the Mobi. He is. I guess he slept well last night. Sabo said with a shrug, not quite sure what was influencing Luffy's good mood. Come to think of it though, all three brothers seemed to be in a better mood than usual. Sabo wasn't going to question it too much though, because it had been a while since the trio had been able to actually enjoy a day. It would be a nice, welcomed change. If we don't hurry, Luffy's gonna cause some sort of trouble. Ace said from experience as he watched the straw hat bobbing its way into a crowd of people that was formed in the streets of the town. Sabo sighed, but still wore a smile as they all picked up the pace to catch up to the youngest. It only took a few seconds for them to catch up, but when they did they saw that Luffy had stopped and was watching something with a small frown on his face. Luffy? Ace asked, looking over to where Luffy was looking. He hadn't even had a chance to fully turn his head before Luffy was walking off towards whatever it was. Luffy, wait. Sabo called as he reached out, trying to grab his brother's shoulder, but missing by only a few inches. Sabo had noticed Luffy's look, and it was slowly forming into more and more of a scowl, when he knew his brother only wore when he was going to fight someone he didn't like. What's going on? Izo asked, looking around as they caught up to the brothers, having gotten stuck in the crowd that surrounded them. Luffy's just being Luffy, Sabo said with a sigh and a shake of his head, as he and Ace pushed their way through the crowd, and after their brother. None of them were fond of crowds, and if it weren't for the fact that they were more focused on Luffy, they probably would be more on edge right now. As it was, they were easily pushing through, and soon they broke out of it and stood in front of everyone, seeing what was happening. Marco and Izo pushed through as well, also stopping to watch. The woman was sitting on her knees, picking fallen flowers up off the ground. In front of her were three burly men who all wore scowls, but their attention wasn't on the woman, it was on Luffy, who looked up at them with a glare. Oh yeah, what are you gonna do about it, you tiny brat? The man closest to Luffy asked. Sabo and Ace both frowned as they realized there was a threat now, but didn't do anything more than watch Luffy carefully. If they tried anything, they would jump in. For now, however, they would just watch. Izo and Marco seemed wary, both glancing at Ace and Sabo, as if wondering if they were going to do anything. When neither brother moved, the two commanders decided they would wait as well, turning and watching Luffy carefully. Hey, isn't that Whitebeard's mark? One of the guys asked, pointing to Luffy's chest where the mark sat proudly. The man closest to Luffy scoffed. You're right, why would a brat like him be on Whitebeard's crew? I don't know, man, I don't think we should mess with him. Well, it's a good thing no one asked you. The brat wants a fight, he'll get one. The one who seemed to be the leader said, raising his fist in preparation. Marco and Izo tensed, and Sabo noticed that Izo's hand moved towards his gun, and Marcos's arms were glowing a faint blue, practically itching to transform into the bright blue flames Sabo remembered seeing. It made Sabo happy that the two were ready to help their brother, but the blonde could see that Luffy would have no issue with the men. Two of them were already terrified just from the Whitebeard mark, and the one who actually wanted to fight looked like he would only be a little bit of a challenge for him. He didn't look like he had any weapons on him, but it was best to be cautious. The fist swung forward in an attempt to hit Luffy, but in a flash, Luffy had disappeared. Everyone besides Ace and Sabo watched in confusion, all wondering where he had gone, but in an instant, he reappeared behind the leader, his own fist pulled behind him. Gum jet pistol. Luffy announced, the leader turning to look at Luffy just in time for the fist to hit him square in the face, sending him crashing into the ground below, unconscious. The other two only watched with wide eyes before turning and running. Sabo sighed but smiled as he shook his head, walking over to the woman who had managed to gather the rest of the flowers off the ground before the fight started. Not that it was much of a fight to begin with. Are you alright, ma'am? Sabo asked, Marco and Izo walking over as well, while Ace went over to Luffy. Manlu, you sure did a number on him. Ace said with a whistle, leaning in to get a better look at the fist imprint on the man's cheek. He was being mean. I don't like mean people. Luffy muttered, looking at the man with a frown for a minute before turning to the woman and smiling. No, lady, you okay? Luffy asked, leaving Ace to wonder about his brother's sudden mood swings. Realizing he would never understand Luffy, Ace shrugged, walking up to the woman with Luffy, while the crowd around them started to disperse. Oh, yes, thank you, she said, standing quickly and dusting off her dress, swiping a strand of hair out of her face. So what was all that about? Ace asked, everyone wondering the same thing. Some guys were being mean so I stopped him, Luffy answered easily, though it did nothing to inform the group. The woman gave a smile at the words before explaining further. I was on my way back to my shop when those three came. They wanted my money, but the thing is, I don't exactly have much in the first place, which only made them mad. She said with a sigh, readjusting the flowers that she held in her arm. And then I beat him up. Luffy repeated simply, crossing his arms and wearing a proud smile. The woman laughed while the others shook their heads. You did. Thank you again for that. Though, I have to ask, when did the Whitebeard pirates get here? Normally those thugs steer clear whenever you come to town. The woman said, raising an eyebrow as she glanced over to the fallen thug. We got here yesterday. Izo supplied before Luffy could give any more vague answers. Strange, I would have thought they would have noticed. She said with a thoughtful look, but shrugged, smiling again. Oh well. Would you all like to come back to my shop with me? I can't offer much, but we do have some pretty good candy in stock, the woman said. Luffy's smile lit up at the mention of sweets. Yeah. Can we go? Plasc Luffy pleaded to the others who watched with amused expressions. Alright Luffy, but only a few pieces. You can get hyper if you eat too much, Sabo said, to which Luffy agreed to easily, cheering. Well, in that case, let's get going. It's not terribly far away, only a couple of minutes. The woman said as she turned and began walking off, the group following. Oh, excuse my poor manners, my name's Winnie. Winnie said as they walked, introducing herself. I'm Sabo, and this is my brother Ace and our younger brother Luffy, Sabo said, pointing to each of them as he did. I'm Marco, you're. And I'm Izo. The commanders said, Winnie nodding. It's still a bit surprising to me to be walking with the infamous commanders of the Whitebeard Pirates, Winnie admitted, everyone smiling at her words. Honestly, we weren't expecting today's events to happen either, Izo admitted, looking over to Luffy who showed no sign of the scowl he wore previously, only a happy-go-lucky look on his face now. When Luffy's involved, nothing ever goes how you expect it to. Ace said, Luffy smiling again as if it was something to be proud of. We'll have to keep that in mind, Marco said with a smile of his own. I'm guessing you three haven't been a part of the crew too long, right? At least, I haven't seen anything about you three. Winnie said, unknowingly having read about them in the newspaper yesterday. After all, everyone had read about the trio from Hell, and many were, understandably, scared of the mysterious children. You're right, we joined about a month ago now, Sabo said. Oh? I have to say, it is surprising that you three are so young. Winnie said in response, though there was nothing in her voice that was condescending, only genuine curiosity as to how three young teenagers had managed to join the strongest crew in the world. Honestly, we're a bit surprised as well, Sabo said, because never in his wildest dreams had he thought this was how his life would turn out. Luffy and Ace seemed to share the same thoughts as him, as they both nodded their agreement. It was quiet after that, but soon enough they were walking up to a shop that had lollipops and caramels sitting in the window. Here we are, Winnie announced, unlocking the door and stepping in, the group following close behind. She walked over to the counter, setting the flowers down. I'm gonna go get a vase for these, but please, go ahead and find anything you'd like, Winnie said as she walked off into a back room, leaving the pirates in the entrance. Yeah. Candy. Luffy cheered, rushing off in between shelves to look at the many choices. Hold on Luffy, don't break anything. Ace shouted as he followed. Sabo sighed, but before he could follow, Izo spoke, stopping him. I have to say, Luffy is full of surprises. The crossdresser said as he looked around, picking up a few candies that looked interesting and looking at them before putting them back. That's an understatement, Sabo mumbled to him as he headed off, wincing as he was sure he heard a crash. Izo and Marco watched him walk off with a smile. It was easy to see that the brothers were much more comfortable around them than they had been when they first got to the ship. It had taken a long time, and there was still a long way to go, but it was nice to know that the brothers weren't forcing themselves to hide so much from them, that they were finally beginning to trust them. This is why you have to wait for us, Luffy. Sabo's voice could be heard from a shelf over as the two commanders walked over, seeing Ace and Sabo on the ground, picking up wrapped candies, and placing them back on the shelf, while Luffy watched sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. Sorry. He apologized, laughing a bit before something caught his eye and he was off again. Luffy. Ace and Sabo shouted, picking up the candies as fast as they could before they charged off after him again, the commanders trailing behind slowly while laughing. Sorry to keep you all waiting. Have you found anything you'd like? Winnie's voice had everyone's attention, all of them turning to see the woman walking out of the back room with a vase in hand, moving to the counter, and placing the flowers she had in them. Yeah. I got all of this. Luffy said, running up to the counter with his arms full of candy, Ace and Sabo chasing him up to the counter and catching their breath. How much? Sabo asked, standing straighter after catching his breath. Oh no, I couldn't possibly charge you guys, you did save me after all. Consider it my thank you to you. Winnie said with a smile. Luffy tilted his head, thinking about it for a second. Alright, but then we're paying for these ones. Luffy said, gesturing to most of the candies in his arms. What? But, cause these ones aren't for us, they're presents. So we can pay for them. Luffy decided, Sabo already pulling the money out and handing it to Winnie who looked a bit flustered. No, I couldn't. It's fine, really, like Luffy said, we'll pay for the ones that aren't for us. We don't mind. Sabo said, putting the money on the counter, the three brothers turning to head off with the commanders. Well thank you. It was nice meeting you all. Winnie called after them. Luffy turned to her, walking backward as he waved. See you later Winnie. Luffy called. Once the group had left the store, Luffy turned back to look at the commanders who were eyeing all the candies they had gotten. I thought you said you only wanted to get a few pieces, Izo said with a raised eyebrow. For Luffy, yes. However, he wanted to get all of you something too. Sabo said, Luffy nodding as he beamed up at them and handed both Izo and Marco a box of assorted chocolates. These ones are yours. And this one's Thatch's, and that one's for Whitebeard, and that one's Josu's, and that one's Ruda's, and Luffy said, pointing to the boxes in his arms as he named off every commander. The two commanders were a bit surprised by the gifts. Thank you, Yue, Marco said eventually once Luffy had finished speaking, smiling too gratefully as he held onto his box. He wasn't usually fond of sweets, but they were nice to have every once in a while. Thank you as well, Luffy, that's very thoughtful of you, Izo said, holding his own box close. It's a thank you for helping me and Sabo and Ace. Come on, we gotta go give everyone theirs too. Luffy chirped happily, practically skipping off towards the Moby. Are we sure he's not being influenced? Ace asked with a raised eyebrow as he watched the cheerful teen skip off. Unless one of us is weirdly happy, I don't think so, Sabo said with a shrug, heading off to follow Luffy, who was paying little to no attention to his surroundings, nearly knocking down a display for someone's stall. The two commanders laughed at that before following as well, along with Ace. The walk back was silent except for a few reprimands by Sabo, as he told Luffy to be more careful, but otherwise, it was a nice peaceful walk. When they reached the Moby, Luffy wasted no time in running on board, and Marco and Izo could already hear him shouting out commanders' names as he passed out the candy. And Whitebeard, this one's yours. Luffy said as he took a much bigger box compared to the others from Ace's hands, and held it out for the giant. Gurarara, thank you Luffy. Whitebeard said with a warm smile, taking the chocolates and putting them on his armrest. Luffy beamed, enjoying the pulse of warmth that came from the captain. The brothers didn't have many good days, but when they did, they were sure to make the best of them. Chapter 64 The Bad After the Good. It was official. The universe hates them. It was either that, or they had extremely shitty luck, but seeing as they got out of the facility, that might not be the case. While yesterday had been a pretty good day, great even, today was not. The brothers hadn't even slept a whole hour before they were being plagued with nightmares left and right. It seemed every time they closed their eyes, there was a new torture waiting for them. It was almost like they were back in the facility, where they were met with new hells every day. The brothers hadn't gotten much sleep at all. At most, they might have gotten 3 hours, but that was debatable. All of their eyelids felt heavy, and even breathing was exhausting, but they didn't want to risk falling back asleep. Sleeping meant dreaming, and dreaming meant nightmares. It was easy for them to figure out that today was going to be one of their bad days as the pirates had dubbed it, and they weren't going to be leaving their room. Sabo could hear breakfast being made, could hear as the pirates slowly realized that the brothers weren't showing up, and then could hear Thatch heading towards their room. Normally, when the brothers had a bad day, the chef would leave them food outside their door, but that had been before the chef knew how much they ate, and could carry it all in his hands. Now, however, the chef needed to use a rolling cart to transport the many servings that the brothers were known to eat. The sound of it made Sabo flinch as memories assaulted his brain, and he briefly felt as if he was back in the dark cold cell, huddling closer to Ace for warmth and listening as their breakfast got closer, the same slop as always. But then he was brought back to reality, a knock on their door telling them their food was there, and then Thatch walking away without a word. The first time this had happened, the chef had stood outside their room for a while, and tried to get them to respond, but once he realized it was futile, he gave up and instead only knocked once before leaving. I'll get it. Ace muttered quietly, exhaustion thick in his voice as he slid out of the bed and shuffled to the door, each step looking as if he was dragging a ball and chain with him. He opened the door and pulled the cart in, promptly shutting the door behind him, and moving the cart to the bed where Sabo was still laying down, and Luffy was curled up, eyes closed. Neither of them could tell if he was awake or not, but when the food got close enough, his eyes opened, answering their question. Breakfast was eaten in silence, all three of them wearing frowns as they slowly picked at their food. The lack of sleep made them feel as if they weren't hungry, but they knew they should eat, so they forced themselves to, even though the normally flavorful array of foods tasted dry and bland. When it was finished, Ace returned the cart to where it had been outside their door, the plates clear of food, and then he returned to bed, laying down and closing his eyes. For the rest of the morning, the brothers shifted through phases of sleeping, being half awake, and being too scared to close their eyes again until exhaustion forced them to. It was a tiring cycle that they all wanted to be over, but it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Lunch came and passed, and Sabo could hear the crew getting ready to set sail again, their time on this island up. It was disheartening to Sabo that they didn't even have the energy to go out on the deck and watch the island drift slowly away, but there was nothing he could do about it. There was no way any of them were leaving the room, no matter how much they wanted to. Being this tired, there was no doubt in Sabo's mind that they were at high risk for falling into panic attacks. Their minds would play tricks on them, and one wrong glance at the wrong person would make the brothers think they had just seen a doctor's coat rather than a white t-shirt. It wasn't something any of them wanted to risk, whether they had the energy to leave the room or not. Sleeping was bad enough, there was no reason to go and make being awake just as bad. Silence reigned over the room along with a thick tension. The brothers were all very active people, so for them to be confined to their room all day was exhausting in and of itself, which didn't make any of this any easier, but what could they do about it? Ace was attempting to sleep again, but Sabo could already hear his brother's heart rate and breathing starting to pick up, signaling that he was having a nightmare. Stretching his arm out to his side, he hit the eldest on the chest, waking him with a startled gasp. Ace had only been asleep for a half hour, but as usual, it wasn't a good sleep. Freaking nightmares. Ace growled out angrily as he lay back down, a scowl on his face. Luffy lay silently on Ace's other side, staring at the ceiling without any expression. His hands were resting on his chest, and his fingers were moving mindlessly. When Ace spoke, his eyes flickered over to look at him, but it was brief and within seconds, he was back to staring at the ceiling. The commanders and captain were all sat in the galley, talking cheerfully amongst themselves. The rest of the crew sat around them, everyone munching happily on all the different breakfast foods Thatch and his division had cooked up that day. Breakfast had only started about 10 to 15 minutes ago, so it was only a bit strange that the infamous three brothers hadn't made their way there yet. "Has anyone seen Ace, Sabo, and Luffy?" Blenheim asked as he sat at the table, another plate of food with him. "I haven't. Normally they're here before I am though," Haruta said, glancing to the empty spots where the brothers usually sat. "Maybe they slept in?" Rikuo asked, but even that was a bit far-fetched. After everything they had learned about the brothers, they knew it was unlikely that they had done that. They had a tendency to get up early and be on time to meals. It was a possibility though, seeing as they seemed to be getting more comfortable around them. "That could be the case, son. Let's just wait and see," Whitebeard said with a comforting smile to the worrying commanders. All of them had taken a liking to the brothers, so it was no surprise to the captain that they were all quick to worry when it came to them. As breakfast dragged on, it quickly became evident that the brothers weren't going to show up. "Do you think it's one of their bad days?" Jiru asked. No one really knew what the brothers did on days like this, where they holed themselves up in their room and refused to leave, but it had happened a few times now. "Most likely. If they haven't shown up by the time breakfast is over, then I'd say it's safe to assume so, Yuri," Marco said, a slight frown on his face as he looked to the doors, waiting for the trio to show up. "A bad day? But they had such a good one yesterday," Thatch said with worry showing on his face. It was true, yesterday had been the happiest the crew had seen the brothers since they had arrived on the Mobi. The commanders and captain had been particularly happy, as well as shocked when they had come back with candies for all of them, but they had all accepted them graciously, taking it as a sign that they were trying to open up to them more, that they were liking and trusting them more. That may have been the case, but we don't even know what causes these bad days. Maybe it had nothing to do with yesterday at all, Izo said with a frown. "That's true, but then what would be the cause?" Vista asked. It was silent after that, many not knowing any answer that they could possibly give to that. "We won't know unless we ask, but for now, let's just continue on with our day and hope that the brothers feel better tomorrow," Whitebeard said, knowing there was no changing how the brothers acted. Even though they were opening up to them, there was still a lot of work that needed to be done in terms of getting the brothers comfortable here on the crew. It seemed the rest of the commanders understood that as well, and breakfast continued in silence. After a while, a small conversation started, but it wasn't as exuberant as it had been previously. Whitebeard sighed, looking over to the doors that Marco had looked towards earlier. Even though the brothers had told them all about their past, there was still a lot that the pirates didn't know about them. The rest of the day passed by slowly for the brothers, and soon they were passing out at the end of the day from exhaustion, thankfully having no more nightmares. As the next morning dawned, they woke up, still feeling a bit groggy, but much better than they had yesterday. They got out of bed, Sabo mumbling that breakfast was about to be ready, and woke themselves up enough to leave their small room and head to the galley. All three of the brothers were still very noticeably tired, but they all resisted the urge to go back to their beds, instead forcing themselves to keep moving down the hall they knew practically by heart now, making their way to the galley. The three walked in silence, occasionally yawning or stretching, and as they reached the galley doors, they pushed them open, all eyes turning to them. Most everyone smiled when they saw them, and some greeted them, which they replied with greetings of their own, heading to their usual spot at the commander's table. Once they received the same reactions, to which they responded in kind. "It's good to see you three again. It was weird without you," Jozu said genuinely, having noticed all of yesterday that something just felt off without the brothers. "Good to see you too. Sorry for any worry we may have caused," Sabo said with a polite smile, a tired look still in his eye as he yawned again, trying to shake away the sleepiness that still desperately clung to him. His mind screamed at him to go get more sleep because Kami knows he didn't get enough yesterday, but he silenced that part of his brain, focusing on those in front of him, rather than how tired he still was. Beside him, Ace and Luffy weren't faring much better than he was. Luffy's head was bobbing, his eyes shutting slowly and opening slower yet, and Ace, whose eyes usually darted around to watch every movement made, was letting his eyes lazily flit around, not quite registering what he was seeing yet. Yeah, the previous day had definitely taken a lot out of the brothers, more so than usual. Usually, they would be able to put up a front that they were just fine, that they weren't affected whatsoever by the day before, but today they didn't have the energy to attempt that. Instead, they let the sleepiness show, the sluggishness. They just had to hope their trust in these pirates wasn't misplaced. The room filled soon enough, and plates were filled with the various breakfast foods being served. Everyone was in the galley now, and the brothers had been greeted by the rest of the commanders and Whitebeard once they arrived. Everyone was eating their food, boisterous conversations being held around them that almost hurt Sabo's ears. The blonde, like his brothers, wasn't completely awake, their minds still sluggishly trying to catch up, and though his hearing wasn't as sensitive as it could be, it was still more sensitive than it normally would be at this point. Because of that, the loud talking and laughter from the pirates were beginning to give him a headache, but he ignored it, knowing that the pirates had no clue that anything was affecting him in the first place. He had a feeling the same thing was happening to Luffy, the youngest's nose scrunching a few times every few minutes, something he usually did when his nose hurt, and he didn't want to rub it in front of everyone or draw attention to it. They seemed to be fine, but there wasn't any harsh lighting in here that could possibly hurt the eldest's eyes. Sabo had a feeling that if they went outside, it would be a different story. "You guys okay?" Marcos's voice snapped Sabo out of his thoughts as he turned to look at the first commander, noticing that all the commanders' eyes were on them now, even Whitebeard's. Sabo forced a small smile, ignoring the growing headache even more. "Yeah, just a bit of a rough time waking up properly. Heightened senses are causing issues, you know," Sabo said, as nonchalantly as he could, as if it wasn't that big a deal. "It wasn't, really, it was just annoying more than anything." "Do you need anything?" King Du asked, not quite sure what he could do to help. All of the brothers shook their heads simultaneously. "We'll be fine by the end of breakfast hopefully. If not, we'll go relax for a bit," Sabo said, knowing there wasn't much anyone could do about it. Unless everyone talked in whispers and they removed anything with smell, they would just have to deal with it. "They've done it before, they'll do it again." "If you say so," Haruta said a bit hesitantly, and the brothers could see that he wanted to do something to help. "Hey, that reminds me, what do you guys do all day on your bad days?" Thatch asked, and though the words sounded blunt and seemed to come from nowhere, the brothers knew that the man was curious about it, Sabo having heard him yesterday, and Luffy feeling the man's emotions. "Lay down, try to sleep," Ace mumbled with a shrug, moving some food around mindlessly on his plate. It felt weird to talk about their bad days so casually because, for Ace and his brothers, those days were exhausting and sometimes even painful. After all, having to relive your worst memories and watch your mind come up with horrible, twisted outcomes of those already bad memories was not a fun experience. "Do you guys normally have trouble sleeping?" Namor asked, genuinely curious and maybe even concerned for them. The brothers were beginning to feel a bit uncomfortable from the topic of these questions, but knew it was something they should at least try to explain the pirates. "Not usually, no, but if we don't get enough sleep we aren't usually in the best of moods, and it's easier for our minds to play tricks on us, which would be no fun for anyone. It's easier for us to just stay in our room," Sabo answered, avoiding the fact that not getting enough sleep was actually the brothers having non-stop nightmares. They were trying to be more open, yes, but that wasn't something that any of them were ready to share just yet. The answer seemed to appease the pirates though because they all relaxed, smiles lighting up their faces. "I thought you guys did that because we did something." "It's a relief to know that wasn't the case," Rikuo said, the rest of the commanders nodding. Sabo smiled at them, shaking his heads. "No need to worry, if it were something you did I'm sure you would know," Sabo said honestly, because the brothers wouldn't be able to hide the fact that something they did affected them. It had happened before, like when they heard Haruta's name. With the end of the questions came the end of the conversation. Sabo had been right in thinking that by the time they had finished breakfast, they would be just fine, because as the brothers pushed away their cleared plates, their senses had returned to normal, or at least, what was normal for them. And they were leaving the galley with smiles on their faces. Going to their usual spot on the railing, the three began relaxing, taking in all the things they had missed out on because of their years being trapped in the facility. The cool wind on their faces, the sounds of the birds flying by and the waves hitting the sides of the ship, the feeling of the warm sun beaming on their skin, the smell of the ocean. It was refreshing, freeing even, for the brothers. It was a constant reminder that they were no longer trapped, that they didn't have to wake up every day fearing the next test they would be given. They would no longer be forced to perform tests that caused them pain or other horrible symptoms. They were free. They could wake up and leave their room if they wanted, or they could snuggle deeper under their blankets and sleep for another few hours. They could go eat a large delicious breakfast, and not worry if they would have to miss out on lunch again. They could sit on the railing and watch the waves, and not worry about being dragged away, so that they could be pumped full of drugs. No one was controlling their lives anymore. Nobody but themselves. Not every day could be a good day, but the brothers weren't going to let that hold them down. Chapter 65. The terrible after the bad. The darkness felt suffocating. It was cold, it was dark, and the ground beneath him was hard, giving no sense of comfort. A quick glance around showed the same thing as always, a dark wall over there, a dark wall back there, another dark wall to his right, and of course, the bars that showed nothing but darkness in front of him. How long had it been since that cell door had been opened? Since he had last been fed. Since he had last seen someone. He didn't know, but the loneliness was almost as suffocating as the darkness. The sound of footsteps made him stiffen in surprise. He tried getting up and moving to the bars, but his body felt heavy and difficult to move, like he had 10-ton weight strapped to his legs. He was forced to sit and wait as the footsteps grew closer, and an even darker shadow began to loom outside his cell. The thing that woke up, though, was anything but human. Its face looked as if it could be a person, but the mouth was far too stretched to be normal. The lips were pulled upwards into a sickening smile, sharp jagged teeth showing, and their eyes looked small and beady in comparison, only adding to the monster-like quality of the thing. It was tall, extremely so. It was hunched over so it didn't hit its head on the ceiling, and it was thin and lanky. Its arms looked abnormally long, and its legs didn't look like they could properly support the creature. There was no hair anywhere on the monster, and its skin was almost too taut, as if there was just barely enough to cover it completely. Its arm stretched out towards the cell bars, showing its long, gangly fingers, and suddenly, the door was being swung open. The creature didn't even need to enter the room. It merely stretched its arm inside and plucked him up from the ground with ease, pulling him towards its face. The heat and smell of the creature's breath made his stomach churn, and every hair was raised in fear as he stared into the creature's beady red eyes. They seemed to sit there for an eternity, and with each passing minute, each second, it felt as if he was going to faint from the terror he felt. Finally, the creature moved, its arm moving somewhere he couldn't see, before retracting back and showing him the gleaming needle it held. A soft whimper escaped as the creature raised the needle to his arm. The pinch as the needle was pushed into his skin made him wince, another, slightly louder, whimper falling out as the liquid was injected into him. And then the needle was pulled out, and he was left to once again stare into the eyes of the terrifying monster, as he slowly felt the effects of that liquid rush through his body. It was excruciating. Every limb, every muscle, every nerve, felt like it was cramping. The cramping quickly began to feel as if it was replaced by fire, and every part of him screamed for relief. When the burning subsided, it was replaced with an itch. An intense, borderline painful itch that he desperately wanted to soothe, but he was still in the monster's grip, still staring into its eyes. This continued on and on and on. A never-ending cycle of pain, from cramping, to burning, to itching, all while staring into the beady eyes, the monster's smile only stretching further on his face. The darkness surrounding them started to cover them now, making it impossible to see the ground. It began to swallow them up, slowly creeping up the legs and hands of the creature, and then its torso and arms, and then its shoulders and neck. It swallowed it all up until all he saw was the monster's eyes staring into his own, and its smile still stretching unnaturally wide. The pirates milled along lazily. The weather was nice, the seas were calm, and breakfast was nearly finished. There wasn't much to do this early in the morning. Most did their chores after breakfast or even lunch, and those on watch hadn't seen anything that would be concerning. It was a normal, lazy morning on the Moby Dick. Jozu, do you think something fun will happen at the next island? Harita asked, slumped over the railing as he watched the water move beside their ship. Jozu, who stood beside Harita, shrugged. I don't know, we haven't been to this one in a while. I'm sure there's something there that you'll find exciting. Jozu said. It wasn't often that the Whitebeards went to islands this close to paradise. Normally, they would take a more direct route right into the New World, but they had decided to hang around the beginning. They were still a couple of days away from the island, but it was already beginning to make the crew excited. I hope so. I feel like it's been a while since we've had an adventure. Harita said, moving out of the slump and standing a bit straighter with a sigh. Wouldn't you call the entire ordeal with the brothers an adventure? Jozu asked with a smirk and a raised eyebrow. Harita rolled his eyes but smiled as well. Of course, but what about a good fight? We haven't had a really good one in a while. Sure, there were those pirates, but even then they weren't much of a challenge. The short, in comparison to Jozu, Commander whined. Anyways, speaking of the brothers, where are they? Harita asked as he scanned the deck curiously for the trio. They were normally up right before breakfast, or even right as breakfast was starting. Jozu, who also scanned the deck, shrugged. Don't know. Probably still sleeping. I'm sure they'll show up once breakfast's underway. He said just as the bell to signal mealtime rang, everyone beginning to make their way towards the galley. Jozu and Harita both pushed themselves off of the railing, and began making their own way to the galley. Wait, Sabo said he could hear everyone right. So he can hear us right now? Harita asked, suddenly remembering that fact. It was something that they were all going to have to get used to, no matter how crazy it seemed. Presumably, yes. If so, hello Sabo, hope your morning's been well so far. Jozu said politely, making Harita smile and laugh a little. However, he said he doesn't normally listen in on conversations. Jozu continued. Unless it was about him or his brothers. Which would mean he is listening. Harita countered. He said he did that because he didn't know us, and wanted to make sure we wouldn't send them back to you-know-where, Jozu said, not using the word facility on the off chance that the blonde was listening. As the two commanders spoke, they entered the galley, moving to sit down in their usual spots at the commander table, all the others already there, except for Fossa and Blenheim, who Joseph remembered, said that they were going to check on something in the depths of the Moby. And if that's the case, then he would still be listening. Just because they joined doesn't mean they aren't worried we might send them back, Haruta said, knowing that trust was something that was hard to earn, especially when you were raised to be always on guard like the brothers were. What are you two talking about? Izo asked with a raised brow, only hearing snippets of the conversation. We're debating whether Sabo's listening in on us right now, Haruta said nonchalantly, as if it wasn't that big a deal. Really, it wasn't. Sabo, Ace, and Luffy were their brothers now, whether they reciprocated those feelings or not, so that meant they accepted everything about them, from their past to their strange abilities. Why would he be doing that? Jiro asked, making Haruta sigh in exasperation at the fact he would have to explain himself again. Well, as I told Josu, he said he doesn't listen in on everyone's conversations, but if he or his brothers are mentioned he listens. That's why I think he could be listening to us now, but Josu here thinks that he isn't listening regardless of what we talk about. Haruta explained, the commanders and Whitebeard all nodding and humming in agreement to the words. Well, they did join the crew, so there's a chance he stopped listening all the time. Flamenco agreed, holding his chin in thought. See? Flamenco agrees with me, Josu said as he smiled smugly. Yeah, but as I said to Josu, just because they joined doesn't mean they're all buddy-buddy with us. I mean, I get why, but I'm just saying, that could mean that he's still listening. It would also mean he's listening to us right now, Haruta countered. Plates were set down at the end of the table, and they turned to see Thatch placing the brothers' breakfast at their empty seats, which confused them. The brothers haven't come yet, King Du asked with furrowed brows. Seems not, Thatch said with a frown, confused. Maybe they're still waking up, Rikuo questioned. Or they're having another bad day, Namor suggested. But they just had a bad day. Can they have one right after another? Vista asked. Who knows, son? We'll wait for them like always, and if they don't show, Thatch will bring them food. If it is another bad day, we're just going to have to be supportive. I'm sure those three are still having a hard time adjusting, Whitebeard said, the commanders nodding their agreement to the words. It was always hard to remember that it hadn't been all that long since they'd rescued the brothers, only a little over a month. In any case, I still think that Sabo's listening, Haruta said confidently. Breakfast continued on normally enough after that, and like the commanders predicted, the brothers were a no-show, which confused more than a few of them. Thatch waited as long as he dared before he knew he was going to have to start prepping for lunch. Just bring them their breakfast, Thatch, Marco said with a sigh as he stood up from the table, he and Thatch the only ones left, both waiting in hopes that the brothers would show up. Alright, Thatch muttered a bit disappointedly. He wasn't disappointed in the brothers, he understood, really. He knew that they had faced a lot of horrible things in their lives. He knew that even though they were physically healed, there was still a long way to go when it came to their mental health, but he had still hoped that the Whitebeards would have been able to work some type of magic and heal them. He wasn't disappointed in the brothers. No, he was more disappointed in himself for not taking the brothers' mental health as seriously as their physical. Sure, he didn't play their mental health issues off, he took them seriously, but he still naively believed that after such a short amount of time, they would be fine. I'll go with you, Yuri, Marco said as he followed Thatch to the kitchen where they began to load food onto the rolling cart. Marco could see the turmoil in his brother's eyes, knew that the chef was beating himself up over something. He didn't know what, but he trusted that if it was important, or if it became an issue, Thatch would come to talk to him, or Pops, or the nurses, or anyone really. The walk to the brothers' room was done silently, and the food was left in its usual place beside their door. A quick knock from Thatch on the door was enough to signal to the trio inside that the food was there, and when there was no response, the two commanders began to head back towards the deck. It just sucks that there are people that can do that to children, Thatch said finally as they neared the door that led out to the deck. It does. We just have to keep showing the brothers that we're not those people. They're safe here, and they'll learn that eventually, Yuri. We just have to be patient with them, Marco soothed. Thatch nodded in understanding, straightening as his resolve to help the brothers get over their past grew. Yeah, you're right. Hey, maybe I'll make something extra meaty for dinner. Luffy seems to really like meat-based dishes. Oh, and maybe some of those chicken tenders with the dips for lunch that Ace likes. And chocolate cake for dessert. Sabo really liked that cake we made that one time. That trembled happily with a smile. Marco felt himself begin to smile as well as the two walked out onto the deck. Sounds like a good idea, Thatch, Marco agreed. Even though the brothers didn't open up about themselves all that much, Thatch was still able to do one thing, and that was figure out what those on the crew enjoyed eating. Some joke that the man had a strange sixth sense when it came to knowing a person's favorite food, but the chef always claimed it was something any good chef should be able to do. You think so? Thatch asked, turning to look at the first mate and commander. I do. If the brothers are having another bad day, I'm sure that you making their favorite meals will definitely cheer them up, Yuri, Marco said, causing Thatch's smile to widen at the thought. It's settled then, tenders and dip for lunch, meat for dinner and cake for dessert. It's time for the next EST. The sing-song, cheery voice sent shivers running down his spine. He urged his legs to move faster than they had been before, but he was already beginning to feel the exhaustion slowing him down. His legs couldn't quite keep the same rhythm as they had been before. He was beginning to trip over himself much easier than before, his feet not coordinating with his brain like he wanted. No, left right left right. Why did his left foot insist on getting in the right one's way? Pushing himself up off the ground, he broke back into a sprint, turning right at the next fork in the never-ending hallway. Behind him, he could hear a cheery tune being whistled, and even though he was running, the person following him was taking slow, even steps, yet they seemed to be gaining on him. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here any longer. He just needed to keep going, and eventually, he would find the exit. This place couldn't go on forever, right? All around the mulberry bush, his breath hitched as a familiar tune began to come out of the man's mouth. The tune echoed eerily throughout the halls, making it seem as if the words were being sung right in his ear. The monkey Chaz the weasel. Faster. He had go faster. 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 A startled yelp escaped his lips as he once again tripped over his own feet, his legs screaming at him, begging him to stop, to rest, but he couldn't do that, not when. The monkey stopped to pull up his sock. He had to start moving. He had to get out. How was he supposed to do that though? It was so dark. Too dark. He could barely see his own hands in front of his face. How was he supposed to find the way out of this maze? It didn't matter, he could do it, he would do it. Footsteps behind him snapped him back to the predicament he was in. The slow, deliberate steps seemed far too close for comfort, the humming in between lines, only chilling him further. Left. Surely if he went left he would find the way out. His footsteps echoed around him nearly as loud as the pounding of his heart in his ears. He ran as fast as he could down the hall, noticing yet another fork in the hallway. Left or right? He had to make the decision quick. Pop. Goes the weasel. He jumped back in shock as the man who he knew for sure had been behind him popped out in front of him from the darkness, a grin spreading over his face as he brandished a long, sharp needle in his hand, his other hand stuffed deep into the pocket of his white coat. It seems our fun is over for now, but no worries, there's more fun to be had back in the lab. The words echoed loudly around him as the boy began backpedaling away from this man. No, monster. No man could be as evil, as sinister, as uncaring of human life as this person. Monster definitely fit the criteria better. Turning to run back the way he came, he was surprised when the monster was there as well, long needle in hand and smile still plastered to his face. Now, the chase is over. You've lost. He didn't have another chance to run before the hand in the monster's pocket shot out and grabbed his wrist, tugging him towards the monster as it shoved its needle into his arm. There. Let test number 462,974 commence. What was once a loud, sharp and clear voice became warbled and muffled as he felt the world tilt sideways. The grip on his wrists never let up, and instead, the monster began to quite literally drag him down the hole. He had tried to keep up, tried to move his legs in time with the monsters, but with the world shifting so uneasily beneath him, it became futile and he fell to the floor, allowing the monster to drag him back into captivity. He hated this. He was almost out, he just knew it, and yet here he was again, being dragged back into the depths of what could only be hell. A place like this couldn't exist anywhere other than hell after all. What seemed to have taken him hours of running took the monster only a few minutes of walking, and they were soon walking into a painfully bright white room. Yes. Hell. That's what this was. They always say that hell is a red fiery inferno filled with suffering and pain. They say it's got cavernous pits and devils with pitchforks. They say it's deep down underground where no one can get to it, and no one can get out of it. Honestly, this wasn't far off from the imagined hell. He knew though. Hell wasn't red, it was painfully white. Yes, there was pain and suffering, but it wasn't given to those who deserved it. Those cavernous pits might not exist here, but there were never-ending halls of darkness that did the job just as well. Devils with pitchforks. What about twisted doctors with scalpels? And it sure did seem that there was no getting out of this place. So yes, this was hell. There was no other place that it could be. Why the long face? Give us a smile, after all, I'm sure your brothers would just love to see it. The fog suddenly cleared, and he found himself sitting in an all-too-familiar straight-back wooden chair, looking at the two metal tables in front of him with two small bodies lying on them. Dread filled him as he opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to do anything, but nothing came out. Not a word, not a scream, not even a whimper. It was dreadfully silent as the footsteps of the monster clicked on the white tile floor, as it made its way to the bodies. Bodies. Bodies of his brothers. The only thing he knew was keeping him sane in this horrible place. No, a smile. Like this. And something was shining in the monster's hands, something that he moved to his brother's head. His mouth opened, it closed, it opened, and yet still, nothing came out. He tried so hard to scream, to shout, to fight against the restraints, but nothing worked. See? Now, why don't you follow your brother's example? The monster lifted his brother up from the table, showing off the large grisly smile he had carved into his brother's face. Tears welled up in his eyes as he watched the blood pour from the cuts, pulling onto his brother's chest and falling to the table. No? Maybe something else will get you smiling then. The monster unceremoniously let go of his brother, the body thumping back down loudly onto the metal table, making him flinch. His brother wasn't moving, it was painfully obvious, and he hadn't made a sound. Surely he would have made some sort of noise while the monster had cut into him, but there hadn't been anything. What about this? Would this make you smile? The monster's voice was still much too cheery for the events taking place in front of him, but he forced himself to look to where the monster was, now at his other brother's side. He was holding him up much like he had the other, and was showing off the carvings he had placed all over. Smiley faces. There were dozens, hundreds even, of various sizes of smiley faces littering his little brother's body. The blood poured out of the boy's body, and it looked as if he had bathed in it. He truly wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but he was stuck. Forced to watch as the monster let his brother go in the same way he had before, walking away from the body and right up to him. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't stop the monster, he couldn't get out, and he couldn't save his brothers. What will it take to get you smiling? Surely, this was worse than any hell anyone could ever imagine. It was a few hours after breakfast had passed. Thatch and the rest of the chefs were cooking up a storm in the kitchen, while the rest of the crew went about their daily tasks. Division commanders went around and made sure things within their division were running smoothly, while the rest of the crew did chores and switched shifts for watch. Remind me to write up a report about the extra wood we need, Blenheim said to Curiel as he walked by. Curiel watched him pass with a raised eyebrow. I thought we just got some more wood, Curiel said, making Blenheim stop to address the commander fully. We did, but it looks like some of the boards down below need replacing soon, which means we'll need to stop somewhere soon to make the necessary repairs. It also means we'll be low on extra Adam's wood, Blenheim said as he leaned against the rail next to Curiel. Ah, that makes sense. We did hit those rough waters a few months ago. Adam's wood sure is tough, but even it begins to wear down after a while, Curiel said knowingly, thinking back to the last time they had to replace boards. It was definitely a long time for them to last, and he was sure that with the replacement of the old boards, they would be able to sail without much incident for a while. Hey you two, have you seen Marco? Izo's voice brought the two out of their conversation. Looking over they saw the geisha man walking up to them, a slight frown on his face as he did. Sorry Izo, last I saw him was when he and Thatch left to bring the trio their breakfast, Curiel said with a shrug. I think I saw him near the infirmary when I was coming back. There he is, Blenheim said, looking past Izo to where the first commander was walking from below deck and heading across the deck towards the commander's rooms. Thank you. Hey Marco. Curiel and Blenheim watched Izo as he left them, moving swiftly through the crowded deck and toward their brother. What do you think Izo wants with Marco? Curiel asked in a hushed tone, lest the man hear him. He knows, but he didn't look all that happy. If I had to guess, I would say he's either low on makeup or fabric. Or someone did something stupid. Blenheim muttered in an equally low tone, neither of them wanting the man to turn his wrath onto them. Let's wish Marco luck, Curiel said, Blenheim nodding his agreement as the two fell silent. Marco, it's a travesty. Izo whined as he caught up with his brother who was making his way to the commander's hall, just as quick as Izo had made his way to him. And what is it this time Izo? Marco asked, only the slightest hint of annoyance in his tone. He loved all of his brothers and sisters, truly he did, but there was only so much one man could take. After dropping the brothers' food off with Thatch, it had been one thing after another. First, the 3rd Division needed more weapons because someone had dropped a box of them overboard, and before they could be retrieved they had sunk deep below the surface. Namor was away on a mission at the moment to check on one of their islands that was reporting a rookie pirate tormenting them, so they couldn't have him retrieve them for them. Then, a group from the 11th Division was delayed in heading off to one of their own missions to recon an island that they were thinking of making a part of their territory, because the boats they had planned on using had sprung leaks. Along with many more various complaints ranging from minor to serious, the latest one had come from the infirmary, the nurses informing him that numbers weren't matching up in terms of the supplies they were supposed to have versus the supplies they did have. Which meant he had to go get the original report from his room to verify things. Which brings them to now, where he was heading to his room to get said report, while Izo followed with a frown that said he had something he was going to complain about. It's horrible. I was mending a shirt for Theo from 5th Division when I realized I'd run out of fabric. I have too many things to fix and mend, and with no fabric, that means everyone's going to be hounding me until I get more and can return their personal items to them fixed. Izo said with a huff as he hid his hands in his sleeves. Marco took a deep, steadying breath as he opened the door to the commander's hallway, he and Izo entering it and closing the door behind them. I'll make sure to set aside some extra money for your division then. We're stopping at an island soon, so Marco paused as he and Izo walked towards his room. To get to his room you had to pass the trio's room, and in doing so they both saw the pile of food still sitting on the rolling cart that he and Thatch had brought earlier. Did Thatch bring the brothers lunch early? Izo asked, looking at the cart in confusion. Whenever the brothers had a bad day they always ate the food, so it was surprising to see it still sitting there untouched. No, that's from breakfast. I brought it down with him, Yuri. Marco said, walking up to the food and examining it to see if any of it had even a bite taken out of it. After finding that it was all untouched he and Izo shared a look before the first mate stepped in front of the door, raising his hand and knocking. No response. Do you think they're okay? Izo asked, worry seeping into his tone as he looked from the closed door to Marco. The Phoenix didn't say anything, instead opting to knock again. Ace. Sabo. Luffy. You three alright, Yuri? Marco called but was once again met with silence. Frowning Marco realized that he was going to have to enter the room. He didn't want to invade on the brothers' privacy, especially if they were having a bad day, but if they weren't eating, then it could be serious. After sharing one more look with Izo, Marco grabbed the handle of the door, twisting it and pushing it open, poking his head in. You guys alright in here? He asked, but stopped when he saw the three brothers lying in their pushed-together beds. All of them looked to be sleeping, however it seemed to be anything but a peaceful sleep. Sweat poured down all of their faces, and their features were scrunched up as if in pain. Luffy looked to be thrashing a bit, and even Ace and Sabo were moving their heads from side to side, as if trying to move away from something. There were low sounds of whimpers coming from them, whichever one though was indistinguishable, and it only made Marco's worry increase. He pushed the door open and entered the room quickly, moving to the bed and attempting to wake Sabo, the closest one to him, up from whatever he was dreaming. Hey, Sabo, wake up, Yuri. He said in a hushed, gentle voice, though there was a bit of urgency to the tone. In the doorway Izo watched with worry, not wanting to get in the way. When Sabo didn't wake up Marco turned to look at Izo, lips thin. Go get another commander. We're taking them to the nurses, Yuri. Marco said sternly, Izo nodding quickly and rushing out onto the deck. He scanned the deck quickly, finding Vista to be the closest. Vista. We need you down here now. Izo called, gaining everyone's attention with his worried shout. Izo. What's wrong? Haruta asked, he and Jiro stopping their spar to look at the man along with everyone else. The geisha man didn't respond though, instead telling Vista to hurry again before turning and rushing back to the brothers' room. He could hear Vista, along with a few others, follow him, but paid them no mind. If something was wrong with the brothers it needed their immediate attention, and if this had been happening since breakfast, they needed that attention 5 hours ago. Izo. Hold on, what's happening? Ignoring the shouts Izo entered the brothers' room again, seeing Marco already shifting Sabo into his arms. Can you get Luffy? Vista, you get Ace. Marco said, his face set in a frown that wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Izo nodded as he rushed over to the bed, gently pulling the youngest towards him and into his arms, ignoring the wrinkles that were inevitably going to be left in the kimono as he did. Vista quickly moved up beside him, pulling Ace just as gently into his arms as they turned to leave the room. Oh my Kami, what's wrong with them? Haruta's voice was hushed, full of surprise as he watched his brothers carry the trio out. He didn't get a response as the three moved quickly out of the hall and out on deck, ignoring the many worried eyes as they rushed to the infirmary. Out in the sunlight, the brothers looked even worse, their skin a pale shade that was almost sickly. Izo could feel Luffy shaking in his arms and worried that the boy might flail like he had seen him do in the bed. Whiskey, the brothers need help, Yuri. Marco called as he barged into the infirmary, Izo and Vista close behind. The head nurse looked up in surprise, but quickly schooled her features as she saw the trio. Set them on the beds. Surely, go get some IVs in case we need them. Whiskey ordered, Mary rushing off to do as told while the commanders did as they were told. What happened? Whiskey asked as she quickly began assessing her new patients. We don't know, they never showed up for breakfast, so we thought it was another one of their bad days, Yuri. When I went to get that report for you I noticed they hadn't eaten the breakfast Thatch made them, so I checked on them and found them like this. Marco said, gesturing to the three who looked to still be in immense pain. Whiskey nodded, jotting notes down on her clipboard. I'll need you all to wait outside. I'll tell you what I know when I know it. Whiskey said, all of them nodding as they turned to leave the room. It was quiet out in the hallway, Marco, Izo, and Vista walking out to see Haruta, Jozu, and Jiro waiting patiently for them. We send the others away. The hall was too crowded for all of them. Jozu said, hinting to the fact that a lot of people were worried about the brothers' well-being. We'll have to calm them down before they cause a panic, Vista said to Marco who nodded. Go and tell them that Whiskey's already on it, Yuri. If they ask what happened tell them we don't know, but Whiskey's doing her best to help them. Marco ordered, Vista nodding as he rushed off to stop a mass panic from happening. I'll go tell Pops, Izo said, his past worry about lack of fabric seeming petty compared to his worry now. The geisha man left the hall quickly, leaving the four commanders alone. So what did happen? Haruta asked softly, worry on his face. He really liked the brothers, and he hoped they were okay, but everything had happened so fast that he didn't even have a clue what happened. Were the brothers hurt? Had someone hurt them? Or had they hurt themselves? He didn't know, and by the looks of it, Marco didn't know either. I don't know, Izo and I noticed that the brothers' breakfast hadn't been touched, so I checked on them, and they all looked like they were in pain and sweating. None of them had fevers, but I couldn't wake any of them, so we brought them to the infirmary. Marco said concisely, massaging his forehead. Haruta frowned. All we can do is wait for the nurse's report, Jozu said softly. Chapter 66. Waking up. The sun was shining, the water was splashing against the side of the boat, and the cuffs were clicking closed around his wrists. A fire burned in his eyes as he glared menacingly at the man who had just locked the draining stone around his wrists, immobilizing his hands from being used to fight. What the hell is this? He growled the words out venomously, but he got no answer, not even a flinch or look of guilt, as he was kicked, literally, off the ship and right onto another. Let's call it getting rid of a pest. He bristled at the words, something breaking painfully inside him. He had trusted them. He had gone against his every instinct, and here it was, biting him in the ass. Now, you'll be home soon, don't you worry, a new voice behind him said, the man walking up to him with a smile, placing his hand on his shoulder. He snarled at the doctor, trying to move away, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. I know you're excited to return, but you don't want to exhaust yourself, the doctor said, the words spoken as if they were supposed to be caring, but he knew that wasn't the case. The only thing those damn doctors cared about was results. Results and their golden children. Bill would be excited to go anywhere with you. He snapped out, the doctor remaining unflinching. No more words were spoken, not because he didn't have more to say, but because a needle was piercing his skin, and everything was starting to feel foggy. His mouth moving at a delay to the words his brain was trying to get out. As much as he wanted to scream, yell, curse, fight, he couldn't. His legs felt weak and he fell to the deck, hands holding him in an upright position as he gasped for breath. It felt like he couldn't breathe, like someone was sitting on his chest, like the air had to be filtered through something before it was allowed to fill his lungs. Sounds became muffled as he looked up, looked over to the other ship beside them, to the ship that had betrayed him, turned him back over to the damn doctors. He could see them looking over their railing, glaring disdainfully at him, some scoffing and leaving as if they had better things to do. He watched as the biggest of them all grinned sinisterly at him, and he knew that pain in his chest wasn't coming from the injection the doctor gave him. He knew that there was nothing they could give him that would hurt him as much as this. As things became too fuzzy to see clearly, he fell sideways, ignoring the wetness running down his cheeks. When he woke up next, he felt groggy, like there was sludge all around him, keeping him from moving fluidly. Blinking a few times and flexing his fingers, he looked around and felt his blood run cold. The blinding white clued him into exactly where he was, and the lack of mobility told him he was sitting in the horrid chair he had gotten all too familiar with. Welcome home. The words were chilling, a shiver racking through his body as he looked up at the doctor who was leaning into his face, smiling. There's so much we have to catch up on. No more dilly-dallying. With a snap of the doctor's fingers, nurses poured into the room, all holding needles or scalpels as they advanced towards him. Despite his struggles, the restraints held him in place, allowing the nurses to poke and prod at him. It felt like hundreds, thousands, of bee stings as needles went in, quickly being replaced by a new one the second the liquid was injected. All the meanwhile the doctor merely stared on, a smile frozen in place on his face as he watched the show. The pain coursed through his body, but that wasn't all that surprising. He knew the second that he had betrayed that this was going to happen. It felt as if cutting off his every limb would be less painful than what was currently happening to him, but he would never get any such relief like that. Not that he wanted that, but at that moment, it felt as if he would give anything for it to just stop. It was hard to breathe again. Not only that, but it hurt to even attempt breathing. Something essential, something he had to do, felt worse than he imagined what suffocating would feel like. What was the point of continuing breathing if every breath he took, his lungs felt like they were on fire? Every time his lungs expanded even marginally, it felt as if someone was shooting him in the chest. And the migraine. It pounded behind his eyes, made everything hard to see. Blinking hurt. Moving his eyes hurt. Moving his head hurt. He just wanted it to be over. When the darkness started creeping into his vision, he welcomed it. So long as he was given some relief from all the torturous pain, he would let anything happen. His labored breathing sounded loud in his ears, his heart pumping alongside it, and he watched as the darkness swallowed the nurses around him. He knew they were still there, he could feel the needles and the scalpels, but he couldn't see them anymore through his spotty vision. All he could see was the doctor staring straight at him, still smiling. The doctor was unmoving, unblinking, uncaring. He would have thought the doctor was a statue if he didn't know any better. His vision was getting even darker now. The doctor was becoming even harder to make out now, but even so, the picture of his smiling face was imprinted on his brain. He let his eyes slide close, hopefully for the last time, and tried to breathe through the pain. They call people monsters, but he knew. People weren't monsters. The true monsters were people. What's the verdict, Whiskey? Marco asked. The commanders and Whitebeard all watched as the nurse fiddled with her clipboard. They were in the meeting room because even though everyone on board was worried about the brothers, they didn't want to start another panic if there was something truly wrong with the brothers. If there was something horribly wrong, the commanders and captain would handle it, and if it was something they, kami forbid, couldn't help, they would have to slowly break it to the crew. I, honestly, have no clue. Whiskey said with a sigh as she looked at her clipboard with a hard look before letting it fall to the table, looking up at Whitebeard. I've done every test I can think of, I checked their blood, I even did tests for the more rare conditions, but I've never seen or heard of anything like this happening before. The head nurse continued with a frustrated look on her face. But are they okay? Thatch asked in concern. He had really come to like the brothers, and after their shitty lives, he just wanted them to be happy and healthy. I don't know. There isn't any damage internally and there isn't anything externally, however, it looks as if they are in pain. Not to mention the sweating and the thrashing. Whiskey said, picking up the clipboard again to re-examine her notes, as if the answer would show itself the 20th time after looking at it. What can you tell us, daughter? Whitebeard asked gently, seeing how conflicted Whiskey looked about the brothers. The nurse looked up at her father figure again, sighing. All I know is that it looks as if the brothers are just sleeping. Whiskey said, confusing everyone again. But we can't wake them up. So is it like a coma? Juru asked, remembering that Marco mentioned trying to wake them up with no success. Yes, exactly, however, people in comas are completely unresponsive. They don't move, they can't feel pain, and they don't react to light or sound. Whiskey informed easily, probably having told this to herself many times while examining the brothers. But the brothers have been moving, Izo said softly, Whiskey nodding. Exactly. The coma would be the easy answer if they weren't so expressive and responsive. There isn't any trauma that would knock them unconscious, and there isn't anything physically wrong with them. It merely seems as if they're sleeping. Dreaming even. My best guess is that they're stuck in REM sleep, which is unusual in of itself. This earned the nurse looks of confusion. Why is that? Fasa asked. Well, when we sleep we go through cycles. The REM cycle is when we have our most vivid dreams. The first cycle, we only stay in REM sleep about 10 minutes, but as we continue cycling the amount of time we stay in that cycle extends longer and longer. What's unusual is the fact that it's been going on this long. Normally, by our last REM cycle, we'll reach maybe an hour, but it should never be as long as this. Not to mention the fact that we can't wake them up at all. Whiskey said, once again putting her clipboard down. So they're basically just dreaming and we can't wake them up. Atmos summarized. Whiskey nodded in confirmation. Are they at risk of getting hurt? Or getting worse? King Du asked. As much as I wish I had answers, I don't. There is the potential that they'll hurt themselves with their thrashing, which is why we've restrained their hands and feet, but other than that, I don't know if this could be permanent, become permanent, or even gets worse somehow. All we can do right now is monitor them and attempt waking them up. Whiskey said. It was silent after that, everyone mulling over the nurse's words. Thank you, daughter. Are we able to visit them? Whitebeard asked, everyone looking at the nurse, all of them wanting to see the brothers despite the state they were in. You can, but it's not exactly a pleasant sight. There are also a few more tests we'll be attempting to wake them up. Whiskey said a bit hesitantly. We understand. If at any point we have to leave, we will. Whitebeard said, the commanders nodding in agreement. Whiskey looked at them all a minute before nodding as well. Alright. I should be heading back now. We can take up to 4 guests for now. She said, standing and picking her clipboard up as she did. She didn't stay long enough to listen to the debate of who got to see them first, deciding her presence was needed more in the infirmary. The brothers had always been a mystery, and even after thinking they had learned all they could about the brothers, they still continued to mystify them. Looking over her notes, again, Whiskey let another huff of frustration fall from her lips. There were no drugs in their systems, they responded to light, they seemed to be feeling pain, and they were moving, which already contradicted what she knew about REM sleep. Whenever someone went into REM sleep, the skeletal muscles would be paralyzed. None of it made sense, but then again, nothing about the brothers made sense. Heightened hearing, heightened smell, heightened eyesight, rapid healing. The list of abnormalities piled high. Not to mention the many phobias and, no doubt, mental illness they had because of their time in the facility. Whiskey had a strong feeling that all 3 of the brothers suffered from PTSD, but due to the brothers' phobia of nurses, she had yet to push the envelope on that subject. She didn't want to scare them away, but she truly wanted to help them. It was a very conflicting feeling. Walking into the infirmary showed her that there had been no improvement in the brothers' condition. Nurses surrounded their beds, all trying to find out what was wrong, and for a brief moment, Whiskey was glad the 3 were comatose, for lack of a better word, while it was happening. If they had been awake, they would be terrified. Shirley, what's the update? Whiskey asked as she walked over to a nurse with reddish-pink hair. Shirley looked over at Whiskey's words before looking at her own clipboard. Nothing much. We tried a few more things to wake them up, but we've been unsuccessful. She said, gesturing to the still very much asleep brothers. Whiskey sighed, moving to see what Shirley had written. Damn. And I thought for sure that one would do something. Whiskey said, looking at one of the methods the nurses had tried. Me too. Didn't do anything though. Shirley said sadly, looking at the brothers again. The door opened and they looked over, noticing it was just the first group of visitors. Yer, Josu, Rikuyo, and Vista all walked in, casting worried glances at the brothers. If you wait there a moment we should be clearing up around the brothers. You can sit near them then. Whiskey said, noticing that, after another failed attempt at waking the brothers up, the nurses were dispersing again. The commanders nodding, waiting patiently until the spaces beside the brothers was clear, before moving to sit down. The brothers, despite being restrained, were still attempting to move their bodies, their straps straining as they pulled, and their faces scrunched in a mixture of what looked like pain and fear. My God, Vista muttered as he sat beside Sabo. I know. We're running out of tests, and at this rate, we're going to have to wait it out. Whiskey said. There was silence, only the sounds coming from the brothers filling the air. Time seemed to pass slowly as all the nurses continued working, the commanders occasionally moving away to let them work. Eventually, those 4 commanders left and a new 4 came in, like a rotation. At one point, Whitebeard himself had even come in to visit, but after the designated time was up, he too left, allowing a new 4 to enter. This went on until it was Marco, Thatch, Izo, and Harita in the room. It was the 4th rotation of commanders, and it had been about 2.5 hours since the brothers had been in the infirmary. Whiskey was at one of the desks in the room, poring over her notes again and again. She only had one more idea that they could try, she was just waiting for a nurse to bring her what she needed in order to attempt it. I've got it, Whiskey. Speak of the devil. As Whiskey got to work on her newest idea, the commanders all sat despairingly at the brothers' bedside. What do you think they're dreaming about? Harita asked softly from where he sat beside Luffy's bed. Izo sighed beside him, looking at Sabo's pained expression. Whatever it is, it doesn't look like a fun dream. He said, moving the blonde's hair from his sweaty forehead, having sat beside Sabo. No kidding, Thatch muttered from where he sat on Luffy's other side. Marco, at Ace's side, sighed, opening his mouth to speak, but stopping when Whiskey started walking over. All of the commanders had been given instructions on what to do when the nurses attempted to wake the brothers up. It was unpredictable what state the 3 would be in if they woke up, so the commanders were to be the first thing they saw rather than a nurse. If the brothers seemed calm, they would unstrap them immediately, but if they seemed hostile, they would attempt to calm them down until they could be let go without worry for anyone's safety. Another test, Yuri? Marco asked instead of whatever he was going to say before. Whiskey nodded, holding a vial of liquid in her hand, the top cork shut. MHMM. If this one doesn't work, it's back to the drawing board, she said with a tired sigh. Marco and the rest of the commanders watched as Whiskey moved to the other side of Ace's bed, where no one was sitting, and uncorked the vial. What is it? Harita asked, eyeing the liquid in confusion. It's like the smelling salt we tried on Ace and Sabo the first time they were brought in. This one, however, has a few changes to it. I added jasmine, which increases beta waves, and citrus and peppermint scents which help in the same way smelling salts do. The nurse said, placing the vial under Ace's nose, careful not to let the thrashing teen's face knock it out of her hand. Doesn't sound like it'll smell all that good, Thatch said, scrunching his nose up in thought, but got no response to his words as everyone watched, hoping the concoction would work. It seemed it wasn't going to though, Ace's face in the same mixture of terror and pain as it had been the whole time, but right as Whiskey began pulling the vial back, pushing the cork back into place, Ace's eyes flew open, and he made the loudest gasp for air the crew had ever heard. It almost sounded as if he hadn't been breathing for a few minutes, and he was only now getting oxygen. Everyone could only stare in shock for a minute before there was finally movement. Marco shot up out of his chair with Thatch, the 2 of them moving to either side of Ace and watching as the teen looked around wildly, the same terror they had seen on his face now in his eyes. Ace? What's going on? Let me go, you damn bastards. Ace's fear left, quickly being replaced with a fiery hatred that shocked the 2 commanders momentarily. Hey, Ace, calm down. I swear when I get my hands on you. Ace cut himself off as he pulled on his restraints furiously. Calm down, Ace, everything's alright. I'm gonna kill you. When I get my hands on you, I'm gonna rip that damn smile off your goddamn face. The snarled words surprised the commanders, but they shook it off, Marco watching as Ace continued straining himself, trying to get out of his restraints. Ace? Marco said firmly, snapping Ace's attention to him. He kept a straight face as the teen stared at him. You need to calm down. No one here is going to hurt you. You're safe, it was just a dream, Yuri. Marco said, his voice still firm, but gentle at the same time. Ace stared at him a minute, his expression slowly relaxing and the anger fading. Marco? Well, what's happening? Ace asked, pulling at the restraints again, this time only gently, as if testing them. You and your brothers have been sleeping. We're not exactly sure, Yuri, but we couldn't wake any of you up. Marco said, and sensing that the teen was calm now, began undoing the restraints, Thatch helping. Sleeping? Crap, where were Luffy and Sabo? Ace asked as if suddenly realizing something, his eyes going wide. Their thatch was cut off when Ace jumped out of the bed, rushing over to Sabo's side. Izo stood up on the other side, in case he needed to stop Ace, but didn't do anything as Ace held Sabo's shoulder in a firm grip, keeping the blonde from thrashing. Hey Sabo, it's alright, it's just a dream, you're safe, we're safe. Ace murmured softly. He continued muttering similar sayings for a few minutes, even when Izo started to tell him that it wasn't working. Ace merely sent a glare to Izo which shut him up, before returning to murmuring to Sabo. Another few minutes later and Whiskey was getting ready to step in and stop the oldest of the brothers, but suddenly the blonde woke up in much the same manner Ace had. Instead of anger like Ace, though, Sabo's face was full of panic. Like Ace though, the blonde pulled against his restraints, and once he realized he was restrained in the first place the panic only grew. Sabo. Calm down, I'm right here, we're out of there, no one's gonna get us. Look, the restraints can be taken off, and they will be taken off. Ace said, unstrapping one of his brother's hand. Sabo's eyes watched as his hand was freed before looking up at Ace. Hey Ace? He asked in confusion, looking around once more. That's right, we're all okay, but we have to wake Luffy up. Ace said, beginning to undo the rest of the restraints with Izo's help. Luffy? He asked, his voice still a bit distant. Yes, Luffy's alright, but he's stuck too, so we have to wake him up. Ace replied softly, helping Sabo sit up once he was completely free. Sleeping? Right, yeah, alright, let's wake him up. Sabo said, seeming to get more of his bearings straight as he also got out of bed, the two brothers heading over to Luffy, the commanders all moving out of their way and watching in interest. Even though they had tried everything they could think of to wake the brothers up, they were able to do it in a handful of minutes, with just the repeating of a few simple phrases. It also seemed as if this had happened before, or at least something similar to it. Luffy, it's alright, you're dreaming, Ace and I are right here, so all you have to do is wake up and it'll all be gone, Sabo said gently, brushing Luffy's hair back. Yeah, everything's alright, we're all safe. We're all free. When you wake up we can go look at the ocean and the clouds. Ace said soothingly. Like with Sabo, it took a few minutes, but finally, Luffy was awake as well, eyes blown open in terror. The tears came quick and fast as Ace and Sabo immediately got rid of the restraints holding the youngest down, and pulled him into their arms. SHH, it's okay Luffy, we're all safe. Sabo murmured quietly in Luffy's ear, and the boy sobbed. The commanders stood awkwardly to the side, not wanting to interrupt. Ace and Sabo seemed to have it handled after all, but there was a lot of questions that they had about exactly what had just happened. Tapping caught their attention, and they noticed Luffy was tapping with his trembling fingers on Ace's arm. I know it smells. Why don't you and I go sit outside for a minute? Ace asked. Luffy nodded fervently at the idea. Haruto looked like he was going to speak up, but Marco placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him from speaking and instead looking at Marco in confusion. Marco merely shook his head, the two of them turning back to watch as Ace and Luffy got out of the bed, Luffy still obviously shaken up, while Sabo remained sitting, watching the two walk off and out of the infirmary. When the door finally shut completely behind the two, Sabo's side, rubbing his forehead as he turned to face the commanders and nurse. Sorry about all this. The blonde said sincerely. No, it's alright, but what was that? Thatch asked, eliciting another sigh from Sabo in response. As much as I wish I had answers to that question, we're as in the dark about this issue as you, Sabo said truthfully. But it looked as if this has happened before, Izo said, thinking back to how easy it was for the brothers to wake each other up. That's true because it has. I'll give the best explanation I can, but as I said before, we don't know much about whatever this was. Sometimes when we go to sleep we just can't wake up. We get stuck in our dreams, or rather, our nightmares, and it's extremely difficult for us to wake up. We don't know how long we would stay asleep without outside assistance, the longest it's lasted before was a few hours. This rarely happens, and we've never had all of us stuck at once, normally it's just one or two of us. Sabo said, his nightmares still flashing behind his eyes, and he had to keep reminding himself that that's all it was. A nightmare. When did this start happening? Whiskey asked. I don't know, sometime during the facility. We've always just assumed it was another test, another side effect from a drug, but then it never went away. My best guess is maybe 3 years in. Sabo said, trying to remember who even got stuck first, but coming up blank. And when you're stuck, you're dreaming. Having a nightmare. Whiskey asked for confirmation. That's right. They're not very pleasant to put it lightly and they're extremely vivid. It may as well be reality for us, so when we wake up, as you saw, we're very disoriented and can't tell the difference between our nightmares and reality. Sabo said. What time is it anyway? He asked, looking over to the window, noticing that it was pretty bright outside. It's almost lunch. We noticed that you didn't eat the breakfast we left for you, so we checked on you and found you still sleeping, but then we couldn't wake you up, Yuri. Marco explained, Sabo's eyebrows furrowing in thought. Definitely the longest yet then. Thank you for helping us out. How did you wake Ace up? Sabo questioned curiously, prompting Whiskey to hold the vial she had used in the air. I made a concoction of the smelling salt I used on you, and it seemed to do the trick after a few minutes. Sabo nodded at the head nurse's explanation, eyeing the vial curiously. He was about to say something more when he turned his head towards the door, everyone doing the same out of instinct. If you'll excuse me for a moment. It seems Luffy's having a bit more difficulty waking up. I'll be back to answer any more questions you have after if you don't mind. Sabo said, his nerves returning as he remembered the fact he was in an infirmary, addressing a nurse. His nightmare came back to his mind, and his every instinct told him it was going to begin to happen right in front of him, but he pushed that thought down, taking a deep breath and standing. Sounds good. I just want to make sure you three are alright, Whiskey said. Sabo smiled to her, nodding before turning and hurrying out the door. He heard the commanders leaving with him, but didn't pay them much mind. It wasn't like they had any reason to stay in the infirmary now that the brothers were out of it after all. He focused his attention back on Ace and Luffy, the former attempting to calm the latter, but it wasn't working as well as it normally would. Walking out onto the deck, Sabo spotted his brothers immediately. It was kind of hard not to when the entire deck was looking their way. Ace sat beside Luffy on the railing, rubbing the youngest back comfortingly as he mumbled soothing words, but they didn't seem to be having the intended effect. Luffy's body was racked with shivers, and both Ace and Sabo knew it wasn't because he was cold. Look, Sabo's right there, we're all safe, all together. No one's gonna hurt us. We're part of the Whitebeard's crew now, and we're here with Thatch and Marco and Izo and Whitebeard. No one's gonna tear us apart here. Ace murmured as Sabo walked up to them. The blonde was quick to climb onto the railing beside Luffy, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. Hey Lou, Ace is right, we're safe here, Sabo said softly, ignoring all of the onlookers the best he could. Once again, he ignored his own nightmare fighting its way into his thoughts, forcing himself to live in the moment. After hours of being stuck though, it made it extremely hard to just push the thoughts aside. But what about the big M monster and the N needles and the D darkness and? None of that here, right Ace? Sabo asked, looking at the oldest who looked around dramatically. Nope, I think we're all clear on monsters, needles, and darkness. Ace assured, turning to look back to Luffy who still looked both worried and terrified. Why don't we go sit with Whitebeard, You can get some warmth and he'll keep all the monsters away for us. Sabo said, nodding to the giant captain who he had seen looking their way with worry every once in a while. Luffy looked toward the captain as well, a bit of hesitance now appearing on his face as he took in the captain's appearance. He had seen the captain many times. He had felt the captain's emotions even more times than that. So why did the man seem so foreign to him right now? Why did everyone around him seem like a stranger, even though he knew for a fact that he had seen them all at least once during his stay here on their ship? Logically, he knew none of them were strangers, none of them were going to hurt him, but something in his mind told him that that wasn't true, that he had to be careful, watch his back. He knew it was because of the nightmare he'd had, knew that was the reason for the confusing thoughts, the feelings of terror and uncertainty, but it didn't help any. With Ace and Sabo at his side, their feelings of love, warmth, and comfort slowly filtering into him, he found it easier to ground himself, to remember he wasn't sleeping anymore, and that being here was okay, he was safe here. That didn't stop the panic, however. All of them. Luffy's voice was small and timid, but Ace and Sabo tried to not let it faze them, their expressions softening. Every single one. No monster is a match for him. Ace boasted easily. It was definitely a turnaround from the man who would have claimed that the captain himself was a monster only a few weeks ago, but it was a welcome change. True, he may only be saying it to keep Luffy calm, but he was saying it nonetheless. Luffy took another nervous glance to the captain, trying to push down the panic, the heavy breathing, the sweat he could still feel lingering on his forehead. I want to go, he said quietly, clenching his fists on the railing one more time before releasing his hold and getting off, Ace and Sabo following. I still have to go talk to Whiskey, but I can stay out here for a little bit until then. I could even ask one of the commanders to go get her and ask her to talk with us out here if you don't want me to go. Sabo said gently to Luffy, not wanting to leave if the boy needed him, but not wanting to scare him more with the nurse if unnecessary. I think I'll be fine with Ace, Luffy said as he walked, eyes glued to the ground as he did. Sabo nodded, he and Ace sharing a look. I'll be as quick as I can and then I'll join you again. The blonde said, the eldest nodding in response as Sabo turned to leave, giving one last comforting squeeze to Luffy's shoulder. He saw the commanders who had been with them in the infirmary at Whitebeard's side, watching the brothers as they made their slow approach, but thankfully none of them attempted to make conversation with them. Sabo took this as a good sign and left his brothers, walking at a quick pace to the infirmary, wanting to get this over with quickly, so he could be with his brothers again. Ace watched Sabo leave, making sure no one bothered him as he disappeared into the Moby. Like his brothers, his own nightmare was clawing its way into his mind, telling him that none of this was real, that this was the dream. He was waiting for the moment he would wake up back in that horrible nightmare land, but realistically, he knew that wouldn't happen. This was reality, not that terrible dream his mind had conjured up in an attempt at showing him his worst fears. When he was sure Sabo was gone safely, he turned his attention back to Luffy and their destination. He easily ignored the stares of the captain and the commanders, instead, focusing on guiding Luffy over to the side of Whitebeard's chair, both of them resting their backs against it. No one said anything to them, and they had no intention of saying anything either, so they all sat in silence save for Ace murmuring words to Luffy whenever it looked like he needed them. As promised, it wasn't too long before Sabo was re-emerging out onto deck, heading right back to Ace and Luffy in seconds. And the three sat there. They sat mostly in silence, sometimes speaking in hushed voices amongst each other, and occasionally tapping to each other, but mostly, it was silent. They sat there until lunch where they ate the food that Thatch brought out onto the deck for them, and they stayed there until dinner, where the gesture was repeated. Sitting out there for that long, you think they would get bored, but after their traumatizing nightmares, all they wanted to do was stay with each other, prove to themselves that everything they had seen was a nightmare, not true. When they finished dinner they got up, ready to head to bed, but Izo stopped them, smiling. I think you three should stay just a bit longer. I'm pretty sure Thatch has something he wanted to give you. Confused, the brothers nodded, sitting back down against the throne that was Whitebeard's chair, waiting for the chef to reappear with whatever it was he wanted to give them. It didn't take too long before he came out, balancing plates on his arms like he was a part of a circus. Dessert is here. Thatch sang as he set the plates out in front of them. Luffy smiled and Ace and Sabo both raised an eyebrow. It wasn't often that Thatch made dessert, but they weren't going to complain, especially seeing as it was food. Cake. Luffy exclaimed happily, grabbing his plate and shoving the sweet into his mouth. Sabo smiled now as well, picking up his own plate. It hadn't escaped any of their notice that the man had made all of their favors today, and that made Sabo's heart warm, knowing that the pirates truly did want to help, even if it was just by doing small things like this. Thank you, Thatch, Sabo said before eating, the chef beaming happily. No problem. I hope you guys like it, he said, and Ace scoffed, though was smiling as well. As if you could make anything we don't like, he said with a slight roll of his eyes, eating with the same ferocity as Luffy. This only seemed to make Thatch beam brighter before he had to excuse himself to make sure the rest of the crew got some dessert. The trio stayed for a few minutes after that, finishing their food, before they finally decided to head to bed. After some quick good nights, they were rushing back to their room, closing their door and falling into bed with tired sighs coming from all of them. Despite the fact that they were worried about having more nightmares, they all fell asleep within minutes. As they slept, they only had nice peaceful dreams of the ocean and big green jungles. Chapter 67. Targeted Attack. Already, the brothers' morning was a much nicer experience than yesterday's had been. That wasn't to say it went without a hitch though. Even though the three were already off to a better start, it was ruined when Luffy quickly began to notice the heavy, omnipresent feeling that hung in the air, cluing him into the fact that someone with darkness was nearby. This, of course, unnerved him and he told his brothers quickly, the two of them stiffening, while Sabo strained his hearing for any telltale signs that a certain person was on board. Within seconds, they had their answer when Sabo let out a sigh, frown on his face. Teach is back. We should be able to avoid him if we stay closer to the right half of the galley on the way to the table. Sabo informed, Ace nodding, while Luffy shivered under the pressure of the horrible feeling. The three sat in their shared room for a few moments longer, gathering themselves before they had to go into the same room with the man they wanted to avoid. When they were ready, they left the room, walking slowly to the galley, Luffy holding on to his brother's hands as tight as ever as they walked. When they were finally at the galley they steeled themselves before entering, and once they did they made a beeline for their table, tunnel vision showing them only their destination and nothing else. They made it without incident, but that didn't mean their hearts weren't pounding from the adrenaline pumping through them. Ace could practically feel Teach's gaze on them and tried as best he could to ignore it, deciding to focus more on the spider on the wall, making its way to a web on the ceiling. Sabo had his hearing trained on everything Teach was letting spill from his mouth, while also doing his best to pay attention to what was happening around them. Luffy was taking deep calming breaths, allowing the captain's warmth to push away the creepy, sickening darkness. Food was placed in front of them, and it didn't go unnoticed by the commanders that the brothers had noticed Teach's return. They had seen the three take the slightly longer way to the table, furthest away from the man, and they could see Ace, who normally watched the entire room, focusing solely on the wall in front of him, not daring to turn his head. All three of them were stiff as boards, though Luffy seemed to be relaxing a bit now that he was sat at the table. Good morning, Izo said in an attempt to calm the brothers, though wasn't sure how successful it would be. It seemed to work marginally because Sabo seemed to snap out of it, turning to the commander with a small smile and a nod. Good morning, Izo, he said, picking up his fork and beginning to eat, a frown replacing the smile quickly. He's listening, Luffy said suddenly, both surprising and confusing Izo and the rest of the commanders, as well as Whitebeard. Listening? Marco asked curiously from where he sat. Luffy nodded, Ace watching the youngest out of the corner of his eye carefully as he began eating quickly, but not so quick that the three could possibly be stuck with Teach out on deck alone. To Teach. Listening for bad things. Luffy said, having noticed that the commanders and captain were worried about them, and decided it would be best to explain things to them. And Ace isn't looking cause he'll just get mad, and then he might end up giving Teach bad looks and make him mad, so he's trying not to look. And I'm letting in warm feelings so I don't have to feel the darkness. Luffy said as he ate, letting in some more warmth at the mention of the darkness. That makes sense, Yuri. Marco finally said after a second of silence from everyone else as they processed the boy's words. After that, conversation slowly resumed as normal. The brothers continued eating at a pace that ensured they wouldn't finish before at least one other commander did, so they would have someone to be out on deck with. It turned out that commander was Izo, and within a few minutes, the four of them were heading to the deck together, Sabo making easy conversation with the man as they made their way out, so as to keep Teach from getting any ideas. It still unnerved the brothers that Teach had been attempting to talk to them the last time he was on the Moby, and they wanted to avoid that at all costs this time. So we're already going to be at another island tomorrow? Sabo asked in confusion. It had only been a few days since they had been to the last one after all. That's right. I'm pretty sure there's a legend about this island, and the last that once said they were connected a long time ago. The two made up an island so large, it took you over a month to walk from one end to the other. Izo said as they walked out onto the deck. Really? Luffy asked in amazement, trying to imagine just how big the island would have to be. Supposedly, yes. Whether that's true or not, who knows, but it does mean that the two islands are extremely close together, and travel between them is short. The commander said. That's nice at least, Sabo said, to which Izo nodded. It is. After all, the crew can get a bit antsy with how short our visits are to some islands, so the fact that we can make 2 visits within 1 week definitely helps out there. As Izo finished speaking, he sat down on the deck, leaning against the railing and pulling out some fabric he had found in his room from a bag at his side and some sewing needles. The brothers had nothing else to do at the moment, so they sat down beside him, Sabo deciding to continue his conversation with the man, while Ace and Luffy had a more silent conversation amongst themselves. So do you do most of the mending for everyone on this ship? The blonde asked, watching as the commander began patching up a hole in some pants. That's right. There were a few in my division who wanted to help out as well, so I taught them the basics, and they help from time to time, but for bigger or more intricate tiers, I normally handle it myself. I also embroider Pop's mark onto clothing whenever anyone wants it. Sabo watched in fascination as Izo spoke. You made all of our clothes when we first got here, right? That's pretty impressive. Are you self-taught? Sabo asked curiously. Mostly, yes. I knew someone when I was younger that taught me the bare basics, but after that, I just taught myself how to do it. Izo replied easily, not hesitating once as he stitched the fabric to the pants. That must have been pretty difficult, the blonde said. Sabo had to learn how to mend clothes back when the brothers lived in the forest. They didn't have a lot of clothes back then after all. He had learned from a book, so he could only imagine how difficult it would be to learn everything else without help. It wasn't too bad. I did have some difficulties when I learned how to embroider, but other than that, it was pretty easy for me to figure out on my own, the geisha man said. Sabo nodded, enjoying learning more about the people they were now on a crew with. All the while, he was having to tune out the conversation-turned-argument between his brothers beside him. Of course, it had started off innocent enough, but as they got more comfortable here on the ship, Ace was also reverting back to his teasing self, and seemed to enjoy riling Luffy up just as much as he used to. Yeah, but fire could burn down that whole ship faster than your rubber could take down everyone on it, Ace retorted with a smirk. Nah. I could use my gum-gum whip and knock everyone off faster than your fire could burn, Luffy replied with a pout. But my fire would make them jump overboard. Mission accomplished, Ace said smugly, crossing his arms over his chest. Rubber's still better. Ace snorted at that. You're right, fire's way cooler. Luffy glared at Ace's response. No way. Rubber. Fire. Rubber. Fire. Would you two stop already? I'm trying to have an actual conversation over here. I don't need to listen to you two argue, Sabo said sternly, eyes narrowed at his two brothers. The blonde's words surprised Izo, who looked up from his mending to look at Ace and Luffy, who Sabo was clearly addressing now. The commander had noticed the two's tapping, but seeing as he had no clue what was being said, he paid it no mind. Obviously, it was something that Sabo had been paying attention to, and apparently it was an argument. But Sabo, tell him, rubber's way cooler, Luffy whined, turning to look at the blonde who was frowning at the two now. Nope. Fire's still better. More effective, Ace retorted, arms still crossed. Seriously? How long is this going to be an argument between you two? It's been so many years, I think I've lost track, Sabo said, shaking his head and pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. Only because Ace is a meanie, Luffy said stubbornly, mimicking Ace by crossing his arms, pouting. More like you're too stubborn to see that fire's cooler than rubber, Ace continued taunting, knowing it would just rile the youngest up again. See? Meanie, Luffy said, pointing to the eldest who merely laughed in response. You know, if you two would just. Sabo stopped mid-sentence, a look of confusion on his face that quickly morphed into concern and slight fear. Sabo. Ace asked, tensing at his brother's sudden change of mood. Luffy tensing as well, both because of his own worry, but also because he could feel Sabo's emotions. Sabo, what's wrong? Ace asked again, Aizo watching with concern now as well, mending forgotten on the deck. SSH, I need to listen, Sabo said, and it didn't sit well with the brothers that Sabo was obviously hearing something distressing, and the only person they could think to be the cause was Teach. As this was happening, more and more of the crew were starting to exit from the galley, all having loud boisterous conversations amongst themselves. 11,062, 11,085, and 10,097 most important close-by intel. He couldn't hear the words clearly, both from a mixture of the loud noise coming from the crew, and because whoever he was listening to was far away. Could you tell everyone to be quiet for a moment? Please? Sabo asked Aizo, nearly forgetting his manners with how stressed he suddenly felt. It didn't sit well with him that there was someone close by that was talking about them, and he had no clue why. He barely saw Aizo nod and get up before he closed his eyes, trying to concentrate on the muffled words. No chances retrieve all dangerous kids. Sabo tried making sense of the words he could hear, tried filling in the blanks, but it was difficult. He could hear the crew around him quieting down, could hear Ace and Luffy shifting nervously beside him, but forced himself to forget about all that for a moment and focus solely on the voice speaking. Someone talking about us. Sabo tapped to his brothers, too focused on listening to talk. Whoever had been talking before was quiet now, another voice speaking instead, but Sabo couldn't make out a single thing they said. Us, or our numbers? Ace questioned because if someone was talking about them, by their names, it would be bad news. Sure, it was already bad that someone was talking about them, but if it was by their numbers, it meant they hadn't figured out who they were yet. Numbers? Look over the railing. Can you see anything? Sabo asked Ace, the teen practically jumping up, nerves scrambled as he looked out at the ocean, searching for anything that could have a person on it. His lips thinned as he quickly spotted a marine ship off in the horizon. They looked like they were heading straight for them, but it would still be a good few hours before they would reach the Moby Dick. Marines. Ace responded, causing Sabo to tense further, his eyes still closed in concentration. What's happening, Yuri? Ace heard Marco ask the question, though it was said quietly, probably because Aizo had urged the crew to stay quiet. The first commander was kneeling beside Luffy, who was watching his brothers carefully, doing his best to ignore the darkness rolling from Teach, who stood somewhere in the crowd of curious people. Sabo hears someone talking about us. Ace sees marine ship. Being quiet so Sabo can concentrate. The voices are far away and hard for him to hear. Luffy whispered back, fingers fidgeting with the ends of his shorts. Marco frowned, looking at Ace's back, and deciding the marine ship was most likely somewhere in the direction he was looking. Sabo's eyes were still closed, a look of deep concentration on his face, and even a bit of frustration. Strong even without devil fruits made sure of it wanted strong marines after all. The voice was a little clearer now, Sabo able to hear more of the conversation than before, but it only made him more confused. These marines clearly knew about the testing, and they seemed to know more about their powers than the news had released, but the last bit confused him. Wanted strong marines. What the heck did that mean? Of course, Sabo had some theories, but who knew what was right? If they're that strong, can we win? It seems no chance, monsters. This was the second voice now, the one that hadn't even been distinguishable before. You think we plan B? Don't worry about them, after this won't be an issue anymore. The more the voices spoke, the worse Sabo felt. What did any of this mean? It didn't sound good for him or his brothers though, he knew that much. But they're wanted alive, can't kill them. Sabo's blood ran cold at the words. All those years they'd spent in the hell that was the facility, they knew there was a high risk that something would go wrong, and one of them would die. It had happened multiple times even. But the fact that they were now out of that place and he could hear someone saying he was going to kill them so confidently, it made Sabo even more worried than when he was in the facility. Screw what the higher-ups say, my life or theirs. I choose theirs. Claim it was an accident, won't know a thing if we use this. So there was something this man had that would kill them. Was it a weapon? An injection? Devil fruit? Sabo wished he could see the people talking, could see what the man was talking about. I guess the second man's voice was full of uncertainty, but the first man just laughed. Don't worry, leave it all to me. The conversation died off after that, but to be sure, Sabo continued listening for another minute. When there was no more conversation about them, Sabo opened his eyes, a deep frown on his face. What's the matter, son? Whitebeard asked. Sabo was shocked out of his current worries at Whitebeard's words, because even though they were part of the crew now, he hadn't really expected Whitebeard to call him by the affectionate term he used with everyone else. After shaking himself from that thought and remembering there were more pressing matters to be concerned over, his frown reappeared. Marines who know about us. I couldn't make much sense of all of it, but what I did hear wasn't good, Sabo said, and he could see the confusion on the crew's faces besides the commanders and captain. After all, they knew nothing about the brothers' enhancements. Looks like they're a few hours away still. Ace informed, still glaring disdainfully towards where the ship was, only causing further confusion. Why don't we go discuss this in the meeting hall, Yor? Marco suggested before everyone could start asking questions at once. Sabo nodded, standing up off the ground along with Luffy and Marco. The commanders all began addressing their own divisions, telling them that they would inform them what was happening after the meeting, which the crew seemed to understand. Sabo also heard Marco telling those who were going on watch to keep an eye out for the marine ship. Meanwhile, Whitebeard and the brothers headed straight to the meeting hall, the brothers finding comfort in the giant man walking with them, even though there were marines threatening their lives only hours away. The walk was quiet, but that was fine with all of them. Luffy was still trying to get over the sudden intense feelings that had come from Ace and Sabo, as well as the fact that he had felt Teach's darkness. All of it was a bad combination for the boy, so he allowed himself to take in more of Whitebeard's warmth, in hopes that it would help calm him down faster. When they reached the meeting hall they took their seats, waiting for the rest of the commanders to join them. Within a few minutes, everyone was there, ready to listen. What did you hear, son? Whitebeard asked Sabo, getting straight to the point. The blonde sighed, sitting up a bit straighter in his chair, as he tried thinking of the best way to explain the chopped sentences he had gotten. I couldn't make out much, they were still too far away, but they definitely know about us. I don't think they know who we are exactly, but they do seem to know we're on the crew, or at least on this ship. Sabo began, already earning confused looks. How? You haven't been here all that long, and you were only just joining in on fights. Curiel said. I don't know. I heard the word intel, but I don't know if that has anything to do with how they found out or not. I didn't hear the context of it. They called us dangerous kids, which isn't really a surprise, but it almost sounded like they were saying they couldn't get all of the dangerous kids. But they didn't have a chance at getting us all. I'm not exactly sure, but they were talking about no chances, retrieving all, and dangerous kids. Sabo said, still having trouble plugging in missing words. After that, they said that we were strong even without our devil fruits, which is true, but the man spoke as if he knew about what powers we had, even though it wasn't in the news. I guess it makes sense because he's a marine though. He also knew about the testing, and he said something about wanted strong marines after all, which didn't make any sense at all. Sabo continued. Maybe they wanted backup. Haruta guessed, but Sabo shook his head. No, I don't think that was it. The way he said it, it was a matter-of-fact kind of speaking, or even proud almost. It didn't make any sense. The guy he was talking to wasn't as confident and was concerned they couldn't win against us, but the first guy was confident they would have no trouble. He said something about a plan B and there wouldn't be a problem anymore after this. Sabo said, Ace and Luffy stiffening at the unsettling words. The second guy was worried because we were wanted alive, but the first guy didn't care about what the higher-up said, and was choosing our lives over his. He said they could claim it was an accident, and it wouldn't matter as long as they used something. I don't know what this thing is, but it doesn't sound good for us if the man's confident tone was anything to go on. This raised some more concern within the group at all the unknowns they were being faced with, as well as their lack of information. The conversation stopped after that, so I didn't hear anything else, but a shrill noise stopped Sabo from speaking. A hiss left his mouth as he covered his ears with his hands, the loud noise muffling anything being said around him. Sabo, Luffy asked in fear, but Sabo couldn't hear it, he could only see Luffy's lips moving and the concern on his face. Sabo, what's wrong? Ace asked in concern. They could see that it was obviously something to do with his ears, but they couldn't hear anything, so what was the problem? There Sabo stopped himself again, realizing he couldn't even hear himself speaking. He didn't want to scream over the noise that the others didn't seem to hear, so he started tapping instead, wincing as the noise continued, not stopping or wavering at all. It was a long, consistent noise that seemed to be all around him, as well as inside his head all at once. Loud noise, probably too high-pitched for you guys to hear, won't stop, can't hear anything. Sabo tapped, Ace and Luffy reading the words easily. There's a loud noise that he thinks is too high-pitched for us to hear. He can't hear anything. Ace relayed for those who couldn't understand. Does he know where it's coming from? Thatch asked, worry etched clearly on his face. Luffy asked the blonde the question and Sabo shook his head, tapping a reply. He doesn't, it sounds like it's everywhere. His guess is it's probably coming from the marine ship. Ace relayed. Fasa, can you go tell navigation to head towards the marine ship? We need to stop whatever this noise is, and seeing as they're already heading our way we may as well meet them. Whitebeard said, Fasa nodding and standing, leaving the room to do as told. You three should head back to your room while we take care of this, Whitebeard said, and Luffy could feel the concern still radiating throughout the room, almost masking the warmth that came from the giant. He turned and looked at Ace, and he could feel the turmoil in his brother, could see that he was fighting himself from exclaiming that he wanted to fight too, but even Luffy knew it would be bad if they did. They wanted to stay hidden from the Marines, and if they fought, they could find out who they were and use whatever weapon they had on them. Alright, Ace said begrudgingly, telling Sabo the plan. Sabo nodded, still holding his ears and trying to ignore the pounding headache that was present thanks to the shrill ringing in his ears. He just wanted the noise gone. I'll walk with you, Izo offered, standing with the brothers. The rest of the commanders stood as well, getting ready to head back out to the deck and make preparations for a battle. Luffy and Ace helped Sabo stand, the sound disorienting the blonde, making him sway a bit, but he righted himself quickly and walked out with them. The walk through the hall was quick, the commanders chatting behind them, Izo making small talk with Luffy, trying to keep him calm, and Ace helping Sabo whenever he swayed. They had only taken a couple of steps out onto the deck when chaos ensued. Pops. The marine ship is closing in, someone said as they ran up, panic on their face, most of the crew at the railing where the marine ship was much closer than it had been when they left. How's that possible? It's only been 20 minutes. Jiru exclaimed as they saw the ship only minutes away now. It was moving at a fast pace which didn't make sense due to the ship's size. We're not sure. We were just about to come inform you, but it suddenly sped up to insane speeds and got closer while you were gone, the crewmate said. Whitebeard frowned, eyeing the ship. Izo, get the brothers to their room, Whitebeard said, Sabo still fighting the loud ringing that no one else could hear. Anoe Aji, Izo said, ushering the brothers along while everyone scrambled for weapons. In the middle of the panic, Ace saw something fly through the sky from the marine ship, landing in the middle of the deck. He didn't have time to warn anyone of what it might be when a loud bang went off. Sabo was pretty sure he was going to be deaf after this. Along with the bang was a bright flash of white that blinded everyone who didn't shield their eyes in time, but Ace, who had been looking right at the explosive, was suddenly overcome with intense pain in his eyes, everything going white and then black. Everyone's ears were ringing and a few couldn't see, but within minutes the effects wore off, and everyone could now hear hissing coming from the explosive, a red gas coming from it. God damn it. Ace hissed, Izo looking at the teen to find him rubbing furiously at his eyes. You alright, Ace? Izo asked in concern. I can't see a damn thing and my eyes hurt like hell. Ace hissed out angrily because this was feeling all too familiar to him, like tests Harry would perform just for the fun of it. It burns. Luffy whined, his voice slightly muffled. Izo looked and saw the teen covering his nose, eyes filled with tears. You alright, Luffy? Ace asked in concern, smelling something. My head hurts, and my nose hurts cause of the really bad smelly stuff, Luffy said. The commanders and Whitebeard, who were still close by, frowned, realizing that all of this seemed geared towards the brothers, incapacitating them through their enhanced senses. Izo, take them to whiskey instead. Everyone else, prepare for a fight, Yori. Marco called, everyone cheering in agreement and raising the weapons they had in the air. Izo quickly ushered the brothers back the way they had come, back towards the infirmary. Luffy held on tightly to Ace's hand with his free hand, the other pinching his nose tightly, his eyes still watering. He guided his blind brother while watching Sabo carefully in case he became unsteady again. Izo walked close at Sabo's side, ready to catch him if needed, the blonde seeming to be extremely disoriented, due to all of the sudden assaults on his eyes and ears. The fight began to sound as they went inside the Mobi, but Izo ignored it, more focused on getting the brothers the help they needed. They reached whiskey quickly, the nurses all having heard the explosion and fighting sounds, already prepping the infirmary for any injured they would have. Whiskey, the brothers need help, Izo called, the nurse spinning at once at the words. One look at the group and she was rushing towards them, calling out orders to the other nurses. What happened? She asked hurriedly, she and Izo guiding them to beds. It seemed like a flashbang went off out there and blinded Ace. It also started releasing some gas that Luffy says feels like it's burning his nose, and Sabo's been hearing a loud ringing in his ears for a few minutes, now that none of us can hear. He thinks it's probably too high a pitch for us to hear, Izo informed quickly so the nurse could help faster. Alright, Izo, go wet a rag and give it to Luffy to smell through. We don't know what's in that gas and it's the best we've got to keep anything harmful from hurting him further. Ace, I need you to open your eyes for me, okay? Whiskey said, Izo rushing off to do as told, while Ace let himself get examined. He could hear the sounds of battle still happening, but tried to ignore it. It was kind of easy when he had the fact that he was blind to pay attention to. How have you been communicating with Sabo? Whiskey asked, not knowing about the brothers' silent language. We used taps. Learned it a long time ago, Ace said as Izo rushed back handing Luffy a wet cloth. Whiskey nodded. Breathe through the cloth for me, Luffy. Also, can you ask Sabo to move his hands for me? I want to make sure there's no damage in his ears. Whiskey asked Luffy, who nodded, getting Sabo's attention and placing the cloth to his nose. Sabo looked at Luffy, and the youngest placed his hand on Sabo's leg, so the blonde would be able to feel the taps and read them easier. Whiskey wants to look at your ears to see if they're hurt. Have to move hands. Luffy tapped Sabo, nodding and moving the hands gingerly from his ears, wincing as the slight muffle was removed and the sound grew louder. I'll be as quick as I can, Whiskey said, though the words fell on deaf ears. She did the checkup quickly as promised before nodding. It doesn't look like damage is being done, but we won't know for sure until the noise is stopped. Surely, can you get me some patches to cover his ears with? We need to muffle the noise as much as possible. Whiskey called to a nurse who nodded, running off to get the items from a cabinet. Do we know where the noise is coming from? Whiskey asked as Shirley brought the patches over. We think it's from the marine ship, but Sabo can't tell. It sounds like it's everywhere. Ace said, still annoyed at his lack of sight. Once Whiskey taped the patch over Sabo's ears, she turned to Ace. In that case, we just have to hope Oyaji stops them quickly. It looks like your eyes will be fine, and you should hopefully regain your sight within a few minutes. It doesn't look like there's been any permanent damage, but we'll know for sure once you get your vision back. It might be blurry for a bit, and you might not be able to see far distances as clearly as usual, but that should all just be a side effect that goes away within a day or two of you regaining your eyesight. Whiskey said, jotting down some notes. That being said, however, it seems that because you have enhanced vision, the flashbang had a more intense effect on you than on anyone else. Normally people regain their eyesight within a couple of minutes in the daylight, but it's already been nearly 10, and you still can't see, correct? Whiskey asked, Ace nodding. Not even light. He muttered in annoyance, looking around blindly. Again, it might not mean anything, but we don't know for sure. We'll have to monitor it and watch for any changes. Do you have any headaches? Nausea? Whiskey asked. The flash hurt my eyes and they still sting a bit, and my head's pounding. Ace said, Whiskey writing that down in her notes. Luffy was relaying all of the information to Sabo, who was worried about Ace, especially since he couldn't hear anything to know what was going on. He could see Ace's eyes moving around wildly, but he didn't know that was because his brother couldn't see until Luffy had told him. He could see Luffy breathing through a now damp cloth, but he didn't know that the gas he had seen earlier was something that made Luffy's sensitive nose burn. He could see it all happening right in front of him, but he had no clue what was really happening. If anything gets any worse or new symptoms start showing up, tell me immediately. What about you, Luffy? Headache? Nausea? Whiskey asked. My head hurts, Luffy said, his voice coming out muffled and a bit nasally from the cloth. Then the same thing goes for you. Anything new, or if anything gets worse, tell us. Luffy nodded at the nurse's words, finding a bit of comfort in the fact that the wet cloth dulled the burn a bit. There wasn't anything anyone could do now but wait and hope the Whitebeards defeated the Marines quickly. The noises of the battle roared on for at least another 15 minutes. In that time, Luffy found that the smell slowly dissipated until it was just a minor sting, allowing him to remove the cloth and breathe freely. Ace was now able to see spots of light in his vision, though nothing substantial yet, and Sabo was still stuck with the ringing. Hey, I can see stuff again. Ace said after a few more minutes, eyes roaming around the room, though still a bit unfocused. Is it blurry? Whiskey asked, having stayed nearby in case the brothers needed her. The other nurses were running in and out, sometimes with a crew member who had gotten injured. Yeah, I can't make anything out, but I can see shapes. Ace said, squinting in an attempt at getting a clearer image, but it didn't help. Beside him, Sabo's brows furrowed. I think the noise is gone, or at least it's quieter now. My ears might just be ringing though. Sabo said, the noise he had been hearing much quieter now than it had been before. Luffy told Whiskey this and she nodded. Do you want me to remove the patches, or do you think we should wait just in case? She asked, feeling it was better if Sabo decided himself. He was the one who could hear the noises after all. Luffy relayed the nurse's words to Sabo and then Sabo's words to Whiskey. He says you can take them off, the noise is getting quieter again, Luffy said. It sounds like the battle's over too, Izo noted, realizing that the deck was growing quiet. Whiskey took off Sabo's patches, and the blonde sat, assessing the noise for a minute. The noise is gone, but my ears are still ringing a bit. I can hear stuff again, but it sounds muffled. Sabo said, his voice a little louder than he intended due to the fact that he couldn't hear normally yet. Whiskey took that as a good sign, and started checking the blonde's ears again, looking for any sign that the loud noise had permanently damaged his ears. Everything looks alright, but as I said with Ace, your hearing might not be the same as it was at first. It'll probably sound muffled for a while. I don't know how long it will take with your enhanced hearing, but it should sound clear eventually. Hopefully by the end of the day at the latest. Whiskey said, Sabo nodding in understanding. Ace, can you follow this light? Whiskey asked, holding a tiny flashlight in front of Ace's eyes, and moving it side to side. Ace did as told, and it seemed Whiskey liked whatever she saw because she smiled a bit. It looks like you're in the clear as well, Ace. Everything's looking good and your eyesight should come back just fine. However, if anything weird happens, tell me. Whiskey said, the eldest nodding. Just as the nurse finished examining Ace's eyes, the infirmary door opened, not for the first time, but instead of a nurse coming in with an injured crew member, it was Haruta. Hey guys, I came to tell you the fight's over, Haruta said as he walked over to the bed they were all sitting at. How'd it go? Izo asked curiously, hands hidden inside his kimono. They weren't all that difficult to take down. The ship had some weird propeller on it, which explains how they got here so fast, but other than that there wasn't anything we couldn't handle. Haruta said with a shrug, the only sign that he'd been in a fight being the sprouting bruise that was starting to show on his hand. Did you find out how they knew the brothers were here? Izo asked, everyone wanting to know the answer to that question. We didn't get much. Once the Marine captain realized that they weren't going to win against us, he tried to run, but Josu got to him first. We didn't get much out of him, but he did spill that the Marines know the Whitebeards were on the island when the facility got destroyed, and they know that the brothers had help in getting the children out, so they just went after us because they're assuming we have the children. Apparently, we were the only outside ship to both arrive and leave within the time frame that the children disappeared from the island. Haruta explained, everyone taking in his words silently. But they don't know who we are. Sabo asked for clarification. Haruta shrugged. We don't think so. The Marine never called you three by name, but he did use your numbers when he tried to get us to hand you over. If they do know your names, they don't know what you look like because they kept fighting as if you were somewhere on deck. I swear, Marines aren't always the brightest. Haruta said with a sigh and a shake of his head. It amazed him sometimes how blinded the Marines could get when they thought they were fighting for justice. I guess they realized no one was reacting to their flashbang like they expected, and once they realized that they all tried running away, Haruta finished. It's a good thing we got you here when we did, or else they definitely would have known who you were, Izo said, the brothers nodding their agreement. It was relieving to know that their identities were still safe for now, but how much longer would that last? The Marines were determined to both find and recapture them, so it was only a matter of time until they were found out. So how are you three holding up? It looks like you've got your hearing back, Sabo. Haruta said, realizing Sabo had been responding, though his voice was a bit louder than he expected it to be for how quiet the infirmary was at the moment. We're all good. The sound stopped a few minutes ago, but my ears are still ringing, and everything's muffled. Ace's eyesight is slowly coming back, and he can only see blurry shapes right now, and Luffy's able to breathe without his nose bothering him too much now. Sabo explained. We figured out that the noise was coming from a tiny machine that they had. We destroyed it and got rid of the flashbang too, Haruta said. Well, you three should be okay to leave. Obviously Ace is going to need some help getting around until his vision returns completely, but other than that you're all set, Whiskey said. The brothers thanked her as she left to go help with everyone else who had come in injured from the fight. You want to go lay down? Sabo asked Ace since he couldn't see anything. Yeah, sure. Ace said with a bit of a frustrated sigh, eyes glancing around the room again, but it was still just a blur to him. Sabo nodded, standing up and smiling to Whiskey. Thank you for the help, Whiskey. He said as Luffy and Ace stood as well, Sabo steadying their impaired brother. It's no problem. Remember, any issues, come right back. Whiskey said, the brothers all nodding and saying goodbye. Izo and Haruta left with the brothers, the two of them speaking amongst themselves. They were out on deck within a few seconds, everyone still cleaning up after the battle. The commanders were going around and helping those who needed it, and instructing others on what to do. Whitebeard sat in his chair, overseeing it all, and when he spotted them he gave them a smile and a nod, which Sabo returned seeing as Ace couldn't see it, and Luffy was more focused on the smell that still semi-lingered out on the deck. Izo and Haruta left them with their own goodbyes as they headed to Whitebeard, while the brothers continued heading to their room. No one stopped them, though a few did call out that they were glad they were okay, and the brothers continued on without being impeded. When they reached their room they all went in, Sabo guiding Ace to his bed and helped him sit down. They all let out a collective sigh of exhaustion and relief. Is there going to be a day where we can just relax? Sabo asked as he moved to lay down on the bed, closing his eyes. Relaxing would be boring. At least we're having adventures, Luffy said, looking on the bright side of things like he always used to. Sabo and Ace smiled at that. Yeah, what are you, Sabo, an old man? Can't handle a little adventure? Ace teased, looking where he knew the blonde's general direction was. I think you and I have a much different definition of the words a little adventure, Ace. I'd rather have the adventure without all the stress involved with it, Sabo said, knowing that was probably never going to happen. Stress seemed to be something that would follow the brothers as long as they breathed. But that's the fun part, Luffy said with a bright smile, Ace nodding in agreement while Sabo rolled his eyes. Of course it is. Now both of you shush, I want to get at least a little rest before lunch, Sabo said, closing his eyes and trying to ignore the dull ring that he still heard. Ace and Luffy both frowned, but decided rest would probably be for the best, the two of them laying down as well. Fine, but only because I can't do anything else right now, Ace said, referring to his lack of sight. Sabo scoffed but didn't respond, the three of them drifting off to sleep quickly. Chapter 68. Getting help. When the brothers woke up from their nap it was because of a knock on their door. Sabo was the first to wake up, his brothers groaning and burying their faces further in the pillows, rather than getting up to answer the door. Sabo grumbled in annoyance at having to be the one to get up, but did it nonetheless, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he walked up to the door. After a quick yawn, he pulled it open, finding Marco standing there. Hey, Marco, what's up? Sabo greeted, blinking a few times, trying to wake up. Lunch is done and Whiskey wanted me to come check up on you guys to make sure you're doing alright, Yoi, Marco said, causing Sabo to remember the events that had happened earlier. He quickly realized that the ringing in his ears were gone, and as far as he could tell, it was back to normal. My hearing's back to normal now I think, and Luffy's good too. I don't know about Ace. Hey Ace. Sabo said, turning to look back into the room to shout at the oldest. Ace hummed, still not opening his eyes. Can you see yet? Sabo asked, annoyed by his brother's lack of physical response. Ace groaned, obviously not wanting to open his eyes to find out, but sat up regardless, blinking open his eyes slowly and looking around. His eyebrows furrowed and he blinked a few times before nodding. Yeah, skinned blurry still, but I'm good. Ace managed to get out, his words slurring slightly. Sabo nodded, turning back to Marco and smiling, feeling more awake now. Seems Ace is better too. Thanks for waking us up, we'll be out for lunch in a minute. Sabo told Marco, to which the commander nodded, giving a quick goodbye before he left. Closing the door, Sabo turned, watching Ace as he rubbed his eyes, nudging Luffy awake as he did. Food? Ace mumbled, making Luffy shoot up in bed, looking around. Food? Where? Luffy asked, sniffing the air for the telltale smell. Where it always is, Luffy, the galley. Wake up first though. Sabo said, shaking his head at his brother's one-track mind. The trio all took some time to wake up before they headed out for lunch. Seeing as there was time for everyone to recover from the battle, more people stopped them on their way to the galley, wondering if they were alright after everything that had happened. Sabo would tell them they were, thanking them for their concern as he did before they continued walking on. Lunch was a much more peaceful event compared to the beginning of their day, even though Teach was still nearby. He was easy to ignore, especially seeing as they were with the commanders and Whitebeard, people who they trusted wouldn't let Teach do anything horrible. After lunch, there wasn't anything nearly as eventful as their morning had been, which was fine with the brothers. It was a slow day, and before they knew it, they were heading off to bed, excited for the island they were going to reach the next day. Come on, I wanna hear about the island. Luffy said, pulling Ace and Sabo by the hands out to the deck. They had just finished breakfast, making sure that someone else was done with them at the same time, and Luffy was eager to hear about the island they were about to reach. It was still a while away so Luffy wouldn't be able to see it clearly himself, but that was where Ace came in. Alright, calm down Luffy, we're coming. Ace said, though he was smiling, both he and Sabo happy to see Luffy looking as energetic and outgoing as he used to be. Being a part of the Whitebeards had definitely helped all of them get past their trauma. That wasn't to say that they were in the clear, because that just wouldn't be true, but more and more, their original personalities were showing. No longer were they as timid as they had been after the facility, they weren't as cautious or introverted. Now they were beginning to trust those they were surrounded by, making it easier to smile, to laugh, to relax. It was a welcome change. Is it big? Is there a forest? Or town? Or animals? Luffy questioned as they reached the railing, the youngest of the trio looking at Ace expectantly for answers to his questions. Ace looked across the ocean, finding the island they were heading towards and taking in as many details as he could see. It's pretty big and there's some forests from what I can see. It does have a big town, but I don't know about animals. I can't see into the forest, the houses are in the way. Ace said, taking in all the details he knew Luffy would want to know about. The trees are tall and it looks like the villagers are getting ready for something. There's a bunch of boxes and stuff hanging around, and everyone looks like they're decorating the town. Ace continued, Luffy beaming at his side as he stared at the island that they were growing ever so slowly closer to. Is it a party? Luffy asked excitedly, nearly bouncing in place. Sabo smiled fondly at his brother's excitement, noticing that Blominko was watching as well, a smile on his face too. Don't know, but it sure does look like it. They have colorful flags out and banners that they're hanging throughout the town. Ace said with a shrug, watching the civilians as they worked to decorate their town. Wow. Do you think we could go to the party? Luffy asked, looking to Sabo who normally dictated whether something was a good idea or not. The blonde merely shrugged. The nose Lou, we don't even know what the party's for. We'll just have to wait and see. Sabo said, calming the overly excited teen down a bit. It didn't take long for Ace to describe everything he could see on the island to Luffy, and soon enough the three were sitting in silence, left with nothing to do for the meantime. They were content to sit there for a while until Sabo suddenly remembered the talk he had had with Whiskey after they'd been stuck in their nightmares. After everything that had happened with the brothers getting stuck, the nurse was very obviously worried for the brothers. When Sabo returned to speak to her alone while Ace and Luffy sat out on the deck, she brought up that she had a feeling the brothers suffered from PTSD, which Sabo was inclined to agree with. Whiskey continued on to say that she knew the brothers still weren't comfortable around nurses, which she understood, but she wanted to help them manage their fears and anxieties. She suggested that the brothers come in, and she could give them ideas on how they could manage, and hopefully help, their PTSD, but that involved going and talking to her about it, which also meant Sabo had to convince Ace and Luffy to go do it. Sure, compared to how they first were, the brothers were much more comfortable around nurses, but compared to a normal person, they were miles away from okay. They knew this, which was why something like this would be difficult for them. Sabo wanted to get better, he wanted to get over the trauma that was the facility, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. It would involve doing things he most definitely didn't want to do, however, and that was the problem, taking those steps to get better, no matter how much he didn't want to do it. So he may as well just bring it up already and see how it goes, because the first step is always the hardest. Ace, Luffy, Sabo managed to finally say. Luffy had known something was going on with Sabo, because his calm, peaceful feelings had quickly morphed into a nervous worry within seconds, but Luffy hadn't mentioned it, knowing Sabo would say something if it was an issue. So it didn't surprise him that the blonde was talking now. Yeah? Ace asked, confused. He could recognize the turmoil on his brother's face, and he wondered what had happened to cause it. Remember when I talked to Whiskey? After we were all stuck. Sabo started slowly, still unsure how he felt about saying this. Ace frowned, his mind thinking the worst, while Luffy continued watching carefully, keeping close attention on his brother's emotions as he spoke. Yeah? She didn't do anything, did she? Ace asked, tone lowering, no doubt ready to go find a boat and leave if that was the case. Whitebeards now or not, if the nurses turned out to be like the doctors at the facility, then he wouldn't hesitate to leave. No, she didn't do anything. It's just we were talking about how we have nightmares and things, and she mentioned that she suspected we have PTSD. Sabo trailed off here, knowing Luffy didn't know what that meant, and while Ace probably had an idea, he probably wasn't too sure about what it meant either. PTSD? Does it mean we're sick? Luffy asked slowly, starting to become a bit worried now. He couldn't be sick, he felt fine. No, well, sort of. It's a mental illness, like our brain is sick. Sabo said, still being careful how he phrased things. Ace frowned more at this while Luffy tried comprehending Sabo's words. People get PTSD after they've been through something traumatic, and it causes you to have things like nightmares and flashbacks, back to whatever the trauma was, among other things. I had a feeling we had it before she mentioned it, but we were talking, and she said she could try and help us overcome it, or at least manage it. Sabo said, leaning on the railing and watching the ocean below him. We don't need a nurse's help. Ace grumbled, arms crossed as he said the words Sabo predicted he would. Normally, I'd agree with you, Ace, but this isn't something I know how to help, and the only ones who do know are the nurses. If we want to get better, we have to get their help. Sabo said gently, even though he was still battling with the idea of asking the nurses for help over something so personal to them. They didn't like the fact that they were constantly plagued with nightmares. They didn't like that they couldn't stand walking in big crowds of people, worried that one of them would pull out a needle on them or see their numbers. And they most certainly didn't like that people who were meant to help them, people who were meant to keep you alive, were people they feared the most. It only ever is one bad apple that ruins the whole bunch after all. We're fine. So what, the nightmares are bad, we can handle them. We have been this long. Ace said with a shrug. Luffy still looked uncertain, like he was having his own thoughts on this subject, but Sabo couldn't decipher whether they were good thoughts or not. I don't want to just handle them though. I want to be able to go to sleep and not dread the fact that I'm going to wake up terrified. I want to be able to go to a nurse and not think they'll pin us down and pull out their needles. I want to be normal, or as normal as possible after what's happened. Sabo said, his tone of voice becoming almost desperate as he spoke. Ace was silent, thinking over his brother's words carefully, while Luffy shifted nervously beside him. If all that comes out of this is I get nightmares every other day rather than every night, I'll be happy. Even if nothing comes of it, I'll still be glad because at least I tried. Sabo said, finishing with a sigh. It was silent amongst them now. The rest of the crew was milling around them, no one stopping to have a conversation with them, no one bothering their tense conversation. The background noise was almost soothing, but it was off-putting at the same time, to be having such a personal conversation out in the open. Just a week ago, they would have never done this, not even by using their silent language. Hell, this wouldn't have even been a topic they would have considered, but the longer they stayed, the more they got to know everyone, the more trustworthy the nurses became to them, and the easier it all was. Do we have to get a shot? Luffy asked, not having any idea what they would have to do to help PTSD. The youngest agreed with Sabo because he didn't enjoy having nightmares every night, but if he had to get a shot to stop them, then he wasn't going to. No, you don't need to get a shot, Lou, Sabo said with a gentle smile. Luffy looked down at the ocean for a second, frowning deeply in thought. I want to try too then. I don't like nightmares, they're scary and they wake me up and they wake you guys up. Luffy said softly, and even Ace seemed to be coming around if his face was anything to go on. Why don't we just go and talk to Whiskey? Before we get to the island. We can ask her what we would have to do, and if we don't like it we don't have to listen. Sabo suggested. Luffy nodded at that idea, the two of them turning to look at Ace who was still frowning, shifting his weight nervously. Yeah, fine. Why do I get the feeling you two will always outnumber me on these things? Ace asked with a sigh, thinking back to how many times his brothers both agreed to do something he didn't want to do, like agreeing to stay with the Whitebeards indefinitely. We wouldn't have to outnumber you if you weren't so stubborn, Sabo said with a good-natured smile, pushing himself off of the railing and placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. I'm not stubborn, I'm cautious. Ace said with a glare, though there was no heat behind it. Cautious? Right. And my name's Rover. Sabo said with a bit of an eye roll. Luffy watched in confusion. No, it's not, he said, wondering why Sabo called himself Rover all of a sudden. Exactly. Now come on, maybe we'll be at the island by the time we're done talking to Whiskey. Sabo said, glancing back to the horizon and noticing that the island was now much more visible to him than it had been previously. It wouldn't be much longer until they were docking. Fine, whatever. This better work, Ace said with a huff, he and Luffy also pushing off against the railing and following Sabo, the three heading back towards the dreaded infirmary that they wanted to avoid. Sabo said nothing in response to Ace's words, instead deciding that silence was better. It wasn't a long walk to the infirmary, and Whiskey was easy to find, so when the brothers walked in they found her within seconds, asking her if they could go talk in her office. She agreed and told them to head there ahead of her seeing as she had something to take care of first, so they left, going straight to the office that was nearby and entering. Like the last time they were in there, Ace stood while Luffy and Sabo sat in the two chairs facing the desk. It didn't take too long for Whiskey to join them, but it was long enough for the brothers to stew in their nervousness and anxieties, so when she finally joined them, all three of them were fidgeting and tapping their feet or fingers nervously. Sorry, there was still some things to take care of after the attack yesterday. Whiskey apologized as she put some papers away in the cabinets before sitting at her desk, giving the brothers her attention. No, it's alright, we didn't mind waiting, Sabo said with a tight smile. Well, what was it you wanted to talk about? The nurse asked, folding her hands on the table. She, of course, had an idea as to what they wanted, but she was going to wait and see if it was correct or not. We were discussing what you and I talked about the other day, about the PTSD and stuff, Sabo said, Whiskey nodding along in understanding. And we decided that we wanted to try and overcome our problems, Sabo said, trying to figure out the best way to phrase the words. I understand. I imagine this is a very difficult topic for you three, especially seeing as one of the problems is medical personnel in general, so I'm glad you three came to this decision. I just want you to know, mental illness is difficult to combat, and sometimes there's no helping it, only managing it. Hopefully, that won't be the case here, she said, the three nodding along as she spoke. She watched them for a second before shuffling a few papers around on her desk. Well, I'm going to need to speak with the three of you to figure out the best way to help you all. Treatments are different for everyone, and symptoms and triggers could be different as well. This way I can figure out what the best course of action would be to take. Of course, I know that one of the issues is me, so this could be a bit difficult to figure out, she said, knowing that the brothers weren't comfortable around her, so asking them to speak to her alone was already asking a lot. The brothers seemed to figure this out as well, all three of them shifting once more in their seats and giving each other glances. If this is something you three do want to go through with, just know that anything we speak of will be kept between us. I will not tell anyone, not even Oyaji, not unless you want me to, she continued to say, wanting them to know everything, if only to help calm them a bit. Again, I know this will be difficult for you three, and I only want to help, but if you decide you can't do it because you don't want to speak with me alone, then I at least have a suggestion that you could try that doesn't involve seeing me, Whiskey said, intriguing the three. They hadn't thought they would be able to help themselves without the nurse and the thought that they could interest them. It's good timing too. On the island we're heading to, you three should go and get yourselves a journal you can write in. I do know that you three have issues with nightmares, and one method that is used to combat nightmares is to write a new ending. Basically, after waking up from a nightmare, get your journal and write a different ending to that nightmare. For example, if I dreamt I was being chased and got caught when I woke up, I would change the ending of the nightmare, and instead write that I was being chased, but I got away safely and I ended up okay. Whiskey explained, the three following along easily. It won't work immediately, and there's a chance it will never work, but it's something you could try if you don't want to see me. She finished, leaving the brothers to their thoughts. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask? She asked, wanting the brothers to be comfortable, wanting them to know she only wanted to help, and maybe if she gave them as much information on this as possible, they would be more inclined to get that help. If we do end up talking to you, what would happen next? Ace asked almost hesitantly, like he didn't want to ask in the first place. She smiled as warmly as possible, knowing this was difficult for the brothers. Well, that'll depend. After we speak privately, I'll discuss different options we could try to help you three. For example, one of you might benefit more from therapy where we talk about what's happened, while another might benefit more from cognitive processing therapy, where I'll help teach you how to change any upsetting thoughts and feelings you might have had since the trauma. Everyone's different, so it's only natural that the treatments would be different, Whiskey said. Can we stop if we don't like it? Luffy asked. The youngest was very particular about his freedoms, as were his brothers, so if something stopped him from having that freedom, he wouldn't want to get involved with it. Of course, if you find that you don't like it, or you don't want to continue for whatever reason, you can stop. No questions asked. Whiskey assured, easing the brothers. The three glanced at each other for another minute, no silent language necessary for them to know that all of them were deeply considering taking the nurse up on her offer. It sounded like it was something they could benefit from, and they really did want the help, but Whiskey had pegged that one of their issues was talking to her, which made all of this that much harder for them. When we talk, where would we do it? Sabo asked, wanting to know if it would be in this office. Talking to the nurse with all of his brothers was easier than without them, especially in such a small, enclosed room. I thought about that. I think it's safe to assume you three don't like the idea of us talking in here, she began, the brothers all shaking their heads at the thought. So I came up with an idea of where we could go instead. I know you all like being out on deck, so I was thinking that I could ask Aji if we could use a section of the deck, and we could talk there instead. Whiskey suggested, the brothers finding that they liked the thought of that much better than they did sitting in here with the nurse. Want to do it? Sabo asked his brothers, wanting their thoughts on the subjects before he agreed or rejected anything. Ace and Luffy thought about it another second before they nodded, both still a bit hesitant. With the confirmation he needed, Sabo turned back to face the nurse. I think we'll do it. The blonde finally conceded, Whiskey's face lighting up happily at the words. Fantastic. I'm happy you three decided to let me try and help you. We don't have to have your talks today seeing as we're about to dock. We can have it once we leave the island, however, I still recommend the three of you get journals while we're here, they could really help. Whiskey said. The brothers nodded along, still feeling a bit jittery with the adrenaline that came with making such a big decision, and soon after they were wrapping up, Sabo thanking the head nurse and the brothers leaving swiftly. Ready to enjoy the island as much as they could in an attempt to avoid the thoughts of what was to come. Being out on deck almost immediately calmed the three down, the sense of familiarity washing over them, and soothing their jumping nerves. After a month of being with the Whitebeards, the brothers had become accustomed to the massive amount of pirates constantly moving and working around the deck, and it almost became a comforting sight to watch it happen. When they had first gotten to the Whitebeards, it had been the complete opposite, the sight of the hundreds of pirates terrifying them, but now it was peaceful. Looking over the railing they saw that the island was only a few minutes away, the pirates getting ready to dock. They hadn't realized just how long their conversation with Whiskey had been, so it was a shock to see the island much closer than they remembered it to be. Adventure. Luffy cheered happily, any and all thoughts of their talk with Whiskey, leaving his mind at the prospect of having another island adventure. Ace and Sabo both smiled at the ease with which Luffy shifted gears, finding that he was slowly turning back into the Luffy they once knew. It was still a long ways off from the original though, and they both wondered if they would ever see Luffy as the same hyperactive carefree boy that he once was. Sorry Luffy, but from the sounds of it the festival's tomorrow. They're only setting it up today. Sabo said, listening uneasily to the conversations happening on the island. This made Luffy pout, and looking to the eldest, Sabo saw that Ace was pouting too. Oh come on, that doesn't mean we can't still have fun, Sabo said, hitting Ace's arm playfully. They both dropped their pouts, looking at Sabo with confused expressions. Normally the blonde wanted to lay low, they all did, so what could he be suggesting they do to have fun on an island they knew nothing about? Reading the expressions easily, Sabo rolled his eyes and shook his head, sighing a bit. Well, first we have to get journals like Whiskey said. After we get those and bring them here we can go and explore a bit. We might even be able to spar too if we can find a good spot, Sabo said with a smile. Immediately, smiles lit up on his brothers' faces, all of them excited at the prospect of getting a good spar in. Fighting the Marines was fun and all, but they weren't enough of a challenge for them. Not after everything they've been through. Yay. Sparring. Luffy cheered, raising his fists in the air happily. Hey, you three. A voice greeted, the brothers all turning to see who it belonged to. Harita, who was being closely followed by Izo, walked up to them, waving with a smile on his face. Hello, how are you two today? Sabo asked politely, returning the smile sent his way. Pretty good. We overheard you talking about a festival, Harita said, Izo nodding along beside him. Yes, Ace saw what looked like the villagers setting up for a festival, and I overheard them talking about it taking place tomorrow, Sabo said. I wanted it to be today, Luffy said, his pout back at the reminder that he wouldn't be able to go to the festival today. We'll still be here tomorrow, you can go then, Izo assured, making Luffy smile again, excitement filling him at the thought. I didn't know there was supposed to be a festival here so soon. Normally this island has them more near the end of the year, Harita said with a pondering look. You guys dock here a lot? Ace asked. Harita nodded, his smile returning. Yeah, whenever we're around really. Since they're so close to the last island it's a good place to restock, and it allows us to split how much we need between two islands, rather than buy out the entire store of one island, Harita said, referencing just how much it took to feed and supply the entirety of the Moby Dick. Which is why it's strange for them to be having a festival, Izo said, his hands hidden in his sleeves. Maybe they just wanted to throw a party, Luffy said, still excited about the prospect of a festival. He had never really been to any festivals, only the New Year's festivals that his village used to throw, but even then they weren't that big or grand. Besides, the last time he had been at that festival was almost a decade ago. Maybe. In any case, Marco's going to be heading onto the island with you again. We should be docking within the next few minutes, so if you want to go wait with him, he's near the helm. Izo informed, having gotten the information from Whitebeard. Thanks for telling us, we'll head there now, Sabo said, all of them bidding goodbye to the two commanders before seeking out Marco. They didn't mind going with the man every time they went onto an island, it made them feel safer. When the entirety of the Marines were after you just because of something they'd forced you to be a part of, it made them feel better about it to have the first commander of the Whitebeard Pirates walk with them whenever they went out. Marco. Luffy cheered, obviously feeling more comfortable around the man as he nearly skipped over to him, a bright smile on his face. Maybe it was the mixture of an island, a festival, and sparring that made him so outgoing and excited all of a sudden. Whatever it was, it made Ace and Sabo feel nostalgic for the Luffy that they had grown up with in the jungle. The one that would walk up to obviously dangerous people and ask them if they could poop. The one who would swing between trees like the monkey his name signified and laugh louder than the tiger that chased him could roar. The one who would run out of Dayton's hut with them to get out of doing chores that the crazy woman should have never expected them to finish, or even start. Ace and Sabo both mentally cursed the facility for changing Luffy so drastically. Hello Luffy. Ace, Sabo, you're. Marco greeted with a smile of his own. We heard you'll be heading out with us again, Sabo said. I will be. Do you three have any ideas of what you'd like to do? Marco asked. Sabo nodded, but was stopped from answering by Luffy who blurted out before anyone could stop him. We're gonna spar. Luffy cheered happily, and Sabo was beginning to think that maybe Luffy had more pent-up energy than they thought he did. It was a good thing they were heading out to spar. Maybe it would help him expel that excess of energy he seemed to have all of a sudden. Yes, Luffy, we'll spar, but first we need to go shopping, remember? Sabo said with a raised eyebrow, reminding the youngest of what they'd talked to Whiskey about. Oh, right, Luffy said, melting a bit, but his smile was still on his face. Shopping? Do you need something, Yuri? Marco asked, looking over at the crew that was now getting ready to disembark. Sabo hesitated a bit, not sure how to quite explain what they were getting. Well, yes. Whiskey recommended we get journals. She said they could help us. Sabo said with a shrug, hoping Marco wouldn't question them more on the subject. It was hard enough to talk to Whiskey about it. Good idea. I know a place you could get some. Marco said, and Ace and Sabo both felt relieved he didn't pry anymore. Ace, do you think we can find cool journals? Like one with a ship on it? Oh. Or one made of bronze. That'd be pretty cool. Luffy said, tugging on Ace's arm. The oldest rolled his eyes but smiled. I don't know Lou, but I'll keep an eye out for the cool ones. Ace assured, Luffy cheering again before he moved closer to the railing to watch the crew finish up everything. What's gotten into him? Ace asked Sabo with a raised eyebrow of his own. Sabo shrugged while Marco watched the two brothers. The commander had noticed Luffy's hyperactivity, but hadn't mentioned it, hoping it meant the youngest was becoming more comfortable around them. I don't know. He seemed normal earlier until we came out on deck. Maybe he's just unusually happy about the island. Sabo asked. Ace looked skeptical about that, turning to look at Luffy's back for a minute. Oi, Lou, are you taking in too much happiness again? Ace asked, and Sabo wondered how that would be the case. Sure, the pirates may be excited about the island too, but wasn't Luffy limiting the amount he took in from the pirates just for that reason? What? No, I don't think so. I stopped taking so much from everyone cause it made me too hyper, remember? Luffy said, blinking slowly a few times in thought. It went quiet a moment as Luffy made a look of concentration, trying to figure out just how much happiness he was filtering in. Just as he thought, the amount he was taking in from the pirates wasn't enough to overload him, but as he noticed that, he also noticed that he was taking in a lot of happiness and excitement from somewhere else. Oh, it's not the pirates. Sorry, I took in too much from the people on the island. They're really excited for the festival. Luffy said, his smile returning as if nothing was wrong. You can feel their emotions? Sabo asked in slight amazement. Sure, they were docked at the island now, but the furthest Luffy had usually been able to feel was anyone on the ship, or if someone was in the ocean right beside the ship. Last they checked, he shouldn't have been able to feel the emotions of people in the town. I guess so. I didn't notice before. Sorry. Luffy said, before turning to watch the crew again. Was he not able to do that previously? Marco asked curiously, watching the entire interaction with interest. No, normally he could only feel anyone on the ship. The furthest it went was anyone beside the ship in the ocean, but not much further than that. Sabo said, voice low in thought. Oh? They're done. Can we go now please? Luffy begged as he skipped back over to his brothers, pulling on their hands and interrupting their discussion. We have to wait until Marco's done, Luffy. Ace said, ruffling his brother's hair. Luffy turned his wide, begging eyes to Marco who smiled again, nodding. We can go now, I've got the money for your journals with me, and then we can go to the forest so you can spar, Yoi, Marco said, patting his side where a bag hung from his waist. Yes. Come on, I want to get the coolest journal, and then I can't wait to spar. Luffy cheered, dragging his brothers off the ship, Marco following close behind. The group went to the shop Marco recommended, and true to his word, there was plenty of journals for the brothers to choose from. Luffy ended up getting the red leather journal with a ship and wave pattern embossed on the bottom corner of it. Ace got a black leather journal with a spade embossed on the front of it, and Sabo got a regular brown leather journal with a compass embossed on the front of it. All three had matching leather strings around them to keep them closed. Sabo also made sure to get some pens for their room, as well as a few books that he was going to make Ace and Luffy read, so they could freshen up on their reading skills. Happy with their purchases, they went back to the Mobi where they dropped their things off in their room before meeting Marco at the dock again, following him to the forest. Luffy chattered happily, and soon they were in a clearing that was perfect for sparring. Marco watched and even gave a few tips and pointers, as they fought to help improve their skills, and soon the sun was setting. Overall, it had definitely been a good day, one the brothers would probably remember as one of the only peaceful days they ever seemed to get. As the man walked along the streets of the village and began nearing the dock, he noticed a group of pirates heading back to their ship. Whitebeards. He knew better than to mess with them without good reason or backup, so he opted to watch the four from afar, making sure they didn't do anything that would endanger the lives of the citizens here. He had been there when the ship first docked, and had watched the pirates mill around throughout their town restocking. He sneered at the thought of the savages, and was about to turn away when he saw something. 3 of the pirates were wearing wristbands, which wasn't all that unusual seeing as it held the Whitebeard mark on it, but one of them was pulled up a bit too far, and underneath it, he was sure that there was something achingly familiar hiding there. Immediately, he pulled out his Kameko and steadied the shot on the teen's wrist, taking a few shots of it. He kept the camera out, noticing now that the 3 with the wristbands were all in their teens, the youngest of them barely looking to be in his teens at all. Swallowing dryly, he refocused his attention to their wrists, taking a few more shots of the coverings they wore on them. He was about to put the camera down when the group stepped on board the infamous Moby Dick, but paused once again when he watched each of the teens begin taking their bands off. Right there, in clear view of his Kameko, were 3 numbers that he, and everyone else, had been on the lookout for. Despite the lack of a face to go with the numbers, the man took as many pictures of the numbers as he could, before letting out the breath he had been holding. After all this time, he was the one to find the infamous demon trio. He was sure to get a promotion after this. Chapter 69. Enjoying a festival. 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 Luffy cheered, arms raising in time with his chant as he walked beside Ace and Sabo. Sabo rolled his eyes, though smiled fondly, and Ace was sharing Luffy's excitement, but lacked the chant and arm motions. Just remember Lu, we still have to be careful. Sabo reiterated as the trio made their way out onto the deck. Luffy nodded quickly, chant forgotten and arms falling back to his sides. I know. And don't let in too many good emotions. Luffy said, repeating the words Ace and Sabo had told him in their room. Exactly. Other than that, let's try to have some fun. Sabo said, feeling that a little fun was long deserved. Ace and Luffy grinned and nodded in unison as they reached Marco, their escort yet again. This time he was with Harita and Izo, the 2 having asked if they could tag along, so they could have a bit of fun as well, to which the brothers saw no harm in and agreed. Ready to go? Izo asked with a smile. Luffy cheered loudly again, fists high in the air once more. Yeah. I can't wait. Do you think they'll have meat? And balloons too. I saw a balloon once a long time ago for a birthday back at our home island, before I met Ace and Sabo, and it was so colorful and it was floating too. Luffy rambled to Harita, who listened diligently at his side while everyone else followed behind them. I don't know if it's all the happy feelings or what, but Luffy's acting more Luffy-like lately. Ace muttered, more to himself than anything. I was thinking the same thing, Sabo admitted, and while he was glad his brother was seeming to go back to normal, he knew that wasn't completely the case. There was still a lot Luffy wasn't doing compared to everything he was doing that seemed like his old self. More Luffy-like? Izo asked, curious. Yeah, you know, loud, excited over anything, practically bouncing off the walls 24/7. That kind of thing. Ace said nonchalantly with a shrug. Sabo rolled his eyes and sighed. What Ace means to say is that Luffy used to be a lot more excitable when we were younger. He didn't exactly have a lot of self-preservation, and would always get himself into dangerous situations in the blink of an eye. I swear, you turned around for 2 seconds, and he somehow managed to have half the jungle chasing him. Sabo said, pinching the bridge of his nose at the memories of having to fight off multiple predators, just because Luffy thought it would be a good idea to pet them. I wouldn't have guessed, Yoi, Marco said honestly, because everything that he and everyone else on the Mobi had seen said otherwise. Sure, ever since the brothers joined, the three had clearly made an effort to be more open and talkative, and Luffy had been acting pretty cheerful recently, but that seemed more like a rare occurrence, rather than the teens' normal behavior. Come on you guys, we're almost there, Luffy said, turning to walk backward, smiling widely as he did. Behind him, the town was bustling excitedly, the sounds of laughter and chatter buzzing in the air. As they had seen briefly yesterday, there was an abundance of banners, balloons, and flags all hanging cheerfully, the biggest banner showing that this festival was meant to celebrate a good early harvest that they'd recently had. We're coming, Lou, don't worry, Sabo reassured. Please, Luffy turned to face forward again, beginning his conversation with Haruta again as if it hadn't stopped. Conversation amongst the rest of the group ceased, only because they were suddenly being engulfed in the crowd of people all attempting to enjoy the festival that spanned the streets. Everywhere they looked they could see stalls selling food or trinkets, people handing out flowers, musicians, dancers, and even a magician. Ace and Sabo looked around in awe, neither of them ever having been to an event like this before. Luffy had grown up for a short time in the village before meeting the two, so he'd been to a few festivals and parties, though they were a lot more scaled back than this one, but Ace had grown up with the bandits and in the jungle. It wasn't like the Tiger Lord was throwing festivals for good catches. Sabo, on the other hand, had grown up for a short time in an actual town, unlike Ace. However, it was filled with nobles who thought throwing festivals like this was too mundane, and made them look like the peasants outside their precious walls. Needless to say, the only parties Sabo ever attended were boring and filled with stuck-up nobles, who only bragged about how much wealthier they were than someone else. This, however, was completely different from all of their past experiences, and it was amazing. We have to get food first. Oh, look Ace, there's a magician. Do you think they can make meat appear out of nowhere? Sabo, look over there, that balloon is so big. How do you think it hasn't popped yet? No, can I go pop? No Luffy, you can't pop the balloon, Sabo said, steering the young teen's eyes away from the balloon by giving him a kebab Ace had gotten during Luffy's rambling. Oh, thanks Sabo, Luffy said, eating the whole thing in one bite. The commanders watched in amusement as the brothers continued on this way, Luffy chattering excitedly and pointing things out for them, while Ace and Sabo curbed him from causing any trouble. They're natural at keeping him focused and out of trouble, Izo noted as Ace once again kept Luffy from running off to do something stupid. If what Sabo said earlier is true, then they've had lots of practice, Marco replied, arms crossed as he followed the brothers closely, not wanting them to get lost. What are you talking about? Haruta asked, having been talking to Luffy earlier and not hearing the earlier conversation. Ace and Sabo were just telling us that Luffy seems to be acting more like his old self lately. Apparently, he was quite a wild child and caused trouble easily. Izo said, noting out of the corner of his eye that Sabo had once again stopped Luffy from stealing food from his stall, making him go back and pay, as well as apologize. Really? I would have never guessed. Haruta murmured, thinking back to how Luffy normally acted around them, and trying to compare it to the Luffy he was seeing now. Neither would I, Yuri. It seems the facility did more damage than we thought, Marco said, the three of them going silent after the comment. Mentioning the dreaded place brought up bad feelings and all that had heard the brothers' story, but they could only imagine what it would be like to actually have to go through everything they did. Well, we just need to show them that we'll never be like those bastards, Haruta said determinedly. Izo and Marco both nodded their agreement. Izo, Marco, Haruta, come on, I wanna go see the people playing music. Luffy cheered, giving them a bright smile that they felt fit the D. Yeah, come on guys, I wanna see them too. Haruta cheered right along with Luffy, the two of them nearly running off together, Ace and Sabo hot on their heels. I swear, Haruta can be just as bad as Luffy supposedly can be, Izo muttered as he picked up his pace, trying to ignore the fact that the bottom of his kimono had just gotten splashed with water from a nearby puddle someone had stepped in. It seems we could probably learn a thing or two from Ace and Sabo, Marco said with a sigh and a shake of his head. You've got that right. Izo sighed back. The group went and enjoyed the musicians, as well as the magician, once they realized how close together they were, and Luffy watched in amazement as the man began pulling a long, colorful train of handkerchiefs from his sleeve. Ace, look. There's so many. Luffy said in awe, tugging on Ace's hand as he watched the cloth pile at the magician's feet. Pretty cool. Ace agreed, also watching in fascination, not having seen a magician before. The next trick was the classic pull a rabbit from a hat, which further amazed Luffy. Sabo watched in amusement, enjoying how Luffy seemed to be letting himself go, letting himself enjoy the festival. There wasn't even a hint of the timid boy from the facility, but Sabo knew that would change once the excitement of the festival was gone. For right now though, it was easy to forget everything they'd gone through. It was easy to just enjoy themselves for once. I think I can see some games over there, Lou. Wanna go try 'em? Sabo asked, getting an eager nod in response along with cheer. Sabo let Luffy drag Ace off, relying on his eldest brother's eyesight to guide them, while Sabo turned to the commanders who had been with them the whole day. You don't mind following us around? Sabo asked, genuinely curious. He didn't imagine that following them as they chased after Luffy was much fun, but they were at a festival. We don't mind. I haven't been able to really enjoy a festival in a while. Thatch normally gets his stupid self drunk, and I have to take care of him, which, might I add, is 100 times worse than this could ever be. Izo said with a shake of his head. Thatch normally tries to drag me into his drinking contests, so I normally stay on this ship, This is a nice change. Marco agreed with a shrug. Yeah, and I love festivals so I don't mind. Why don't I show you why Thatch swears I cheat in ring toss? Haruta asked, waggling his eyebrows and smirking as the group followed after Ace and Luffy, who were already at one of the many games stalls. Sounds like fun, Ruta, Sabo said with a smile, glad that he and his brothers weren't forcing the commanders to do anything they deemed as boring or annoying. He didn't think that following them around and babysitting them would be all that fun, but they truly didn't seem to mind, which put him at ease. Once they caught up, Haruta did as promised and bought himself a few rounds of ring toss, winning with nearly perfect accuracy the entire time. Luffy was awed once again, and Ace was watching Haruta skeptically, trying to figure out just how he was so good at the game. Needless to say, Sabo agreed with Thatch's thoughts that Haruta somehow cheated at the game. The group moved throughout the game's stalls, occasionally stopping to play a few before continuing on, and all too soon, the sun was beginning to set. It felt as if the day had flown by, but now they had to start heading back to the Mobi. The thought of that didn't scare the brothers like it used to though. It no longer brought a feeling of fear and anxiety to think about staying with the pirates on the Mobi. Sure, they were still terrified of Teach, but with the efforts they made to avoid him, and with help from the commanders and Whitebeard himself, it was easy to pretend he wasn't on the ship. Even if his presence did set them on edge. The walk back was a bit subdued, everyone tired from walking around all day long and having fun. It was a good subdued, peaceful one you felt after making good memories. The rest of the village seemed to feel the same way as they did as the loud, boisterous chatter and laughter slowly died down into a dull, peaceful quiet. There was still laughter and people talking, but it wasn't nearly as loud as before, as people slowly began making their way back home. As they walked, the brothers took their time taking in the festival, knowing it might be a while before they stumbled upon an island that was celebrating something again, and it was then that Sabo was bumped into. It was an honest accident, neither Sabo nor the man had been paying attention, and the man was quick to apologize, which Sabo waved off with an apology of his own. However, he noticed that, when he'd been bumped into, his wristband had inched too far up, uncovering the numbers it hid ever so slightly. It was enough to make Sabo briefly panic as he readjusted the band, looking around quickly to make sure no one had seen. The only one looking at him was Luffy, who had noticed his sudden panic, but he just smiled reassuringly to his brother, calmer now after seeing no one looking his way. Luffy smiled back, turning to face forward again. Sabo quietly reprimanded himself, telling himself to be more careful, and left it at that. He and his brothers had had fun today, and he wanted to have more days like this. Maybe, with Whiskey's help, they could have a lot more happy days like this. He had been looking around nearly all day now. First, he had waited by the infamous Moby Dick, careful not to be seen by any of the pirates, but as the village grew more and more animated due to the festival, and more pirates bustled off their ship to join in, it grew harder for him to find any sign of the three he'd seen yesterday. He didn't have much to go off of after all. All he knew was they all had wristbands, and they all had hats. If they weren't wearing their hats, he was screwed, because everyone looked the same in this crowd, and there were quite a few people milling around that were wearing some kind of covering on their wrist, whether it be a wristband, a bracelet, watch, you name it. He barely even knew their hair color, and it was nothing that would stand out either, two dark-haired teens and the blonde. He sighed once again, ready to give up altogether. This seemed to be an impossible mission, but if he did it, he just knew he would get that promotion. Everyone had been looking for this demon trio, and if he was the one to find them, his days of working on this tiny, boring island would be gone. He may even get a few soldiers of his own to command. With a renewed vigor he began inspecting each and every person that walked past him, looking for any similarities between the three he'd seen yesterday and the people in front of him. Would they be walking in a group? Or would they split up? If they split up, it would definitely be more difficult for him to recognize them. He just had to hope that the demon trio liked to stay a trio, and didn't like exploring alone. Narrowed eyes skimmed across the crowd, deciding those who couldn't be the trio whether they were too tall, too old, too young, or weren't wearing a cover on their wrist, and took in all those who could be them. He hadn't seen anyone wearing the hats he'd seen yesterday, which only further proved his previous thoughts, that they might not even be wearing them today, but just as he thought that he spotted them. They were already well into the town's festivities, probably having been there the entire time he'd been waiting near the docks. They were at one of the food stalls, the trio mingling amongst a group that he knew to be commanders of the Whitebeards. Just his luck. Moving quickly, he merged into the crowd, keeping his focus trained on the group that was now making their way towards some of the provided entertainment, a local man who claimed to be a magician and some musicians. Once again, he had yet to see the trio's faces, but their hats were just as he remembered, and as he looked at their wrists, he saw the same bands on them, all showing off the Whitebeard Pirates' Jolly Roger. Thinking quickly, he raised his Kameko and snapped a shot of the symbol, prepared to show it in his report to help prove the Marine's previous theory that the Whitebeards had aided the children from the facility in escaping. The group stopped to watch the magician as he started pulling a never-ending supply of colorful handkerchiefs from his sleeve, and he took this time to position himself into a better spot so he could see their faces. Try as he might though, it was for naught, because as soon as he tried making his way through the crowd to get a better view, everyone decided now was the time to get in his way. To avoid drawing attention to himself, he waited calmly as quite a large group of people crossed right in front of his path, keeping him from advancing. Once they were gone, so was the demon trio. With an angry remark, he scanned the surrounding area to try and figure out where they had gone, thanking his lucky stars when he found them relatively quickly. They were walking away from the entertainment and off towards some games that had been set up. Chase beginning anew, he hurried after them, still cautious enough to keep enough distance to not look suspicious. Once they stopped again, he attempted yet again to get a better angle, and this time was able to do so without issue. He had to awkwardly maneuver between people and stand quite obviously in between a cluster of houses, but he finally had a view of the demon trio. To say they didn't look like he expected, though, would be an understatement. When he'd first heard about the trio, he had spent countless days wondering what kind of ruthless monsters they could be, wondered how scary they would look, how deadly they were. Looking at the three teens though, he wondered if he even had the right kids after all. Shaking his head from those thoughts, he frowned, raising his Kameko up to get the shots he needed. No matter how innocent someone looked, that didn't mean they weren't the scum of the earth. After all, just take the devil child from O'Hare for instance. After getting the pictures, he decided to continue following them, both to make sure they didn't cause trouble, and to make sure he really did have the right kids. He wouldn't know that for sure though unless one of them moved their wristbands, and he wasn't about to get his hopes up that that would happen again. He followed them around for another few hours before something happened. With the big crowd, it was only inevitable that you would get bumped into, and that's exactly what happened to the blonde. Someone bumped right into him, and with a smile, the blonde waved it off, but in doing so, the Marine saw that his wristband had been ever so slightly nudged, showing the hints of his number underneath. He seemed to realize it at the same time the blonde did, but he was quick to get a shot before the blonde could cover it back up. He also had to quickly duck behind his stall when the blonde began looking around, a slight look of panic in his eyes at the thought that someone might have seen. Taking deep breaths to calm his racing heart at nearly getting caught, the Marine slowly poked his head around the cart, ignoring the looks he was getting for how strange he looked to the villagers. Seeing that the group was once again on the move, not having noticed him, he sighed in relief, deciding to quit while he was ahead. He had their pictures, he had evidence it was them, and he had proof they were with the Whitebeards. Hello promotion, goodbye Boring Island. Chapter 70. The first session. Ready to cast off. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy watched as the Moby left the island they'd been at, smiling at the memory of all the fun they'd had at the festival the day before. Today, however, they had to do something they didn't really want to do, but knew it would be best if they did. Honestly, Sabo was beginning to notice a pattern one he wasn't liking, because every time the brothers have an even remotely good day, it's always followed by a pretty shitty one. Hopefully, that wouldn't be the case, and all that would happen would be that the brothers would be uncomfortable seeing as they had to talk to Whiskey. The only saving grace from all of this was that they would be talking out on deck, which was a lot nicer of a thought than talking to her in her office. Speaking of, Whiskey's on her way, Sabo said with a hint of a sigh, trying to calm himself, knowing it wouldn't help if Luffy was feeling not only his own panic, but his brother's as well. Do we have to do this? Ace muttered, training his eyes on the water lapping against the side of the ocean. No, we don't have to, but we should. We all agreed this could help us a lot. You don't need to do it, Ace, you either, Luffy, but it could help. Sabo said, reiterating to them that they had the freedom to do whatever they wanted. Whiskey had said so herself, and Sabo was immensely grateful they now had the freedom to choose. Hello you three, are you ready? Whiskey asked, smiling gently to them, her posture relaxed, trying to look as peaceful as possible. If it were anyone else, the brothers would be fine, but just because she was a nurse, she was intimidating. As ready as we'll ever be, Sabo said with his best smile. She nodded knowingly. Pops permitted us to use the upper deck, and promised to keep anyone from interrupting unless absolutely necessary. He even has Marco and Harita doing watch right now to make sure some of the more nosy members don't listen in. No one but Pops knows about what we're talking about, just that they're not allowed to listen in, and as I said before, Pops won't know anything that we talk about during these sessions either, he only knows that I'm helping you three. Whiskey explained, gesturing to the upper deck. The brothers nodded, feeling a bit more comfortable after hearing that. They trusted Marco and were beginning to trust the rest of the commanders, namely Haruta, so they were relieved to hear they would be helping them out as well, even if they didn't completely know what they were doing. The group of four headed to the upper deck, reaching it quickly before settling down. Whiskey had a notebook and pencil in preparation, reading over something before nodding to herself and looking up. To begin, as I said before, I'll have private talks with each of you to figure out the best way to help you. I know you don't like the idea of being alone with me in a group, much less one-on-one, but it would be beneficial to do this individually, rather than all together. The other two can sit on the steps right there, within viewing distance, but I'd rather you not listen in if you can help it. Whiskey explained slowly. The brothers had expected this. Sabo mentioned it might be the case, and they talked about what they would do. They had eventually decided after a long debate that they would have a safe word. If Whiskey started doing anything they couldn't handle, they just had to say the safe word kangaroo and the other two brothers would come and end the session, simple as that. Hearing that they could sit close by made it easier for them, and they all nodded along to the condition. Whiskey smiled, having expected more of a fight about the suggestion, but was pleasantly surprised that hadn't been the case. In that case, does anyone want to go first? She asked, watching as the brothers shifted, taking note of their every movement and expression, every reaction they had to her words and suggestions. As she wanted to take on the task of helping the brothers get better, she had to know more about them, more about what set them off, more about how they reacted to certain situations, and to do that she had to be as observant as possible. I believe I'm going first, Sabo said, shifting a bit, sitting up straighter. Sounds good. Who's going next after Sabo? Whiskey asked so she knew which one to call after she was done talking to Sabo. Me? Ace muttered. And that means Luffy last then. If you don't mind, Ace, Luffy, could you go sit over there? I'll call you over when we're done. Whiskey said after taking note of the order. The two nodded a bit hesitantly, but got up and left without any argument. Whiskey and Sabo watched as they walked to the step, sitting on the second one from the top, before beginning to talk amongst themselves. Starting is always the hardest, but remember, at any time you can ask me any questions you might have. Whiskey said as she turned to a new sheet of paper in her notebook, Sabo watching her carefully and nodding. I know that everything you three went through was traumatizing, but I don't know to what extent seeing as I haven't heard anything about your past. I'm not asking you to tell me everything all at once, but it would help if I did know more. However, why don't we start somewhere a bit easier? What's something you want to be able to get out of this? Something you have difficulty doing now that you want to get better at? Whiskey asked, leaving Sabo to think for a moment. I think I want to be able to do a few things. Maybe have fewer nightmares, or even be able to walk by new people without being so scared. Sabo said, shifting a bit. It always was uncomfortable for him to share his feelings with those he wasn't close with. Ace and Luffy were always the two he could talk to about anything, and it was weird letting in more people. Do you have nightmares often? The nurse asked, writing as she spoke. Sabo merely nodded in response. How often? Every week. Every few days. Every other night. Sabo shifts again, reminding himself that this was something he had to talk about if he wanted help. Most nights. Sometimes every other night. He answered, gaze shifting to the deck in between him and the nurse. And how far apart would you be okay with the nightmares being? Would you want them to be gone completely, or would it be fine for you if they only happened a few times a month? Whiskey continued questioning. It'd be nice if they stopped completely, but I don't know how realistic that is, so I'm fine with just a few times a week if anything. The blonde replied truthfully. It was exhausting to have nightmares every night, so if he could even have a day or two break in between, that would be all he would need. What about what you said earlier? Walking around strangers. How do you normally feel when confronted with someone you don't know? Whiskey asked, flipping a page in her notebook. Cautious, nervous, scared, Sabo said, swallowing. And you want to meet someone new without feeling any of that? Whiskey asked, Sabo, nodding in answer. Well, that should be all for now. This was only the first session, so it may not have been as in-depth as the next few could be, but it's a good start. It helped you set some goals for the end result, and it let me know what we should start working on. If you want to keep doing this, then I suggest we have another one of these sessions later in the week. Whiskey informed, Sabo, nodding along, showing he understood. Honestly, he was kind of surprised that it was over so soon, and that everything he had feared would happen hadn't. Not once did Whiskey do or ask him to say anything that he wasn't okay with, and he was a bit amazed that a nurse of all people hadn't tried dragging anything out of him against his will. Right, he had to change that way of thinking, because not all nurses were bad. Thank you, Whiskey. I'll see you next time then, he said, brushing his pants off as he stood. Whiskey smiled to him, saying her own farewell before calling Ace over. The eldest had turned, a scowl forming on his face instinctually before quickly disappearing as he stood up. He ruffled Luffy's hair and grumbled something that the nurse couldn't hear, but had Sabo rolling his eyes. Sabo smiled at his brother's stubbornness, but decided that was probably how he was coping with all the new things happening around him. Ace was obviously reluctant as he walked over to the nurse and sat down in front of her. She didn't seem to take offense to it though, and continued to smile at him, which he didn't know if he liked or not. He didn't know what she and Sabo had talked about, but the blonde hadn't abandoned the session, and he didn't look too shaken up afterward, so it couldn't have been all that bad. Despite these thoughts though, Ace still found it difficult to be sitting and talking to a nurse of all people. Willingly. Hello Ace. I appreciate that you decided to talk with me. I know how hard this must be for you, she said, turning pages in her notebook. Ace shrugged, shifting nervously. It's not that bad I guess, he said, but knew his own words were a lie. For him, this was borderline torture. He had agreed to try and get help from the nurse though, so he would stick it out for at least the first session. Still, something like this is hard for most people to do without the right encouragement. People who need help normally don't get it until it's too late, Whiskey said. Ace didn't quite know how to respond to that and opted for silence, deciding the nurse would probably continue the conversation. We'll start the same way I did with Sabo, and remember, you can ask questions at any time, so feel free to interrupt me if you have to. Whiskey reiterated for Ace, who nodded. Good. Now, what's something you'd like to get out of these sessions? The trauma you've had to face has no doubt changed your personality, or maybe even your thinking. What's something you want to be able to do later that you can't do now? Whiskey asked. Ace thought for a moment, looking towards his hands that were holding onto his ankles as he sat crisscross on the deck. I don't know, be able to control my emotions better. It used to be worse, but whenever I don't know how to handle my emotions, I just get angry about it and explode, and that's not good around Luffy cause then he gets angry too, and I don't want that to happen. And I don't like the nightmares either, Ace admitted, trying to force away the flush from admitting to someone the things that he had issues with. It was true though, he'd never been all that good at expressing his feelings, and it normally made him angry as a result. Not to mention, having nightmares every night was a pain in the ass. That's a good goal, Ace. Having difficulty expressing yourself is alright, it happens to the best of us. Honestly, I have issues with it myself at times, so I understand wanting to get more control over it, the head nurse said, still smiling gently. Her words made Ace look up, a bit of skepticism in his eyes at her words, but mostly believing them to be true. She didn't look like she was lying just to make him feel better, but he wouldn't know for sure unless Luffy got a read on her feelings and told him. What emotions do you have the most difficult time with? Whiskey asked, continuing the questioning, snapping Ace out of his thoughts. I used to be really bad with people showing me any kind of affection. I used to be mean because I didn't really know how to respond, and if I get flustered or too confused, I just get angry instead, Ace explained, watching Whiskey's pencil glide along her notebook as a way to focus on something that wasn't the nurse herself. And the nightmares. Do you want them gone completely, or would you be happy with having them every once in a while? Whiskey asked. It doesn't really matter to me, as long as it's not every damn night, Ace said, a bit of anger slipping into his tone at the thought of how annoying and terrifying the nightmares were for him. Not to mention exhausting. Understandable, Whiskey said before giving Ace the same closing she'd given Sabo, telling the eldest that this was only the first session, which was meant more for him to set goals, rather than get into anything too heavy right away. He nodded along with her words, taking them all in, slowly relaxing as he realized they were already done. He hadn't even realized before that Sabo's session had been so quick, too nervous about his own to notice, but now that he was done with his own, he realized that it had only been about 10 minutes long. Are all sessions gonna be this short? Ace asked curiously. No, as I said, this was only the first session. Normally they'll be about 30 minutes to an hour, seeing as we'll have much more to talk about, she said. Ace nodded understandingly. Well, it was nice speaking with you, Ace. I hope you'll continue these sessions, Whiskey said as a means of a farewell. Ace said his own goodbye as he stood, mind still reeling at the fact that this session had been a lot easier than he had expected. Sure, they hadn't even talked about much yet, but he was relieved that Whiskey didn't seem to be expecting him to talk about anything he wasn't ready to talk about yet. As he had these thoughts, he heard Whiskey calling over Luffy for his own session, and began subconsciously sending the youngest bursts of warmth, knowing he was just as nervous, if not more, as he had been. Luffy stood a bit slowly from the step, Sabo patting his back reassuringly and telling him something quietly, to which Luffy nodded. Ace and Luffy passed each other, and Ace clapped Luffy's shoulder, telling him it'd be alright before going to join Sabo on the step. Luffy didn't know how to feel about this at all. On one hand, he was extremely nervous about having to talk to the nurse, someone he still couldn't figure out whether they were a good person or not, and on the other, he felt that this would go just fine, because Ace and Sabo seemed to be alright. Their nervousness had even gone away and they felt better after talking to her. As much as he wanted that to help though, it didn't, and his stomach flipped back and forth uncomfortably at the thought of talking to the nurse. Even as he sat right in front of her, even as he felt the warmth radiating from Ace and Sabo, even as he felt nothing but calm, peaceful feelings coming from Whiskey, he couldn't bring himself to stop feeling that horrible nervous anxiety. Hello Luffy, Whiskey said simply, having a feeling Luffy needed a minute to calm himself. He was fidgeting worse than Ace and Sabo had combined. Hi, Luffy replied hesitantly, voice quiet and timid. He tried letting other people's happiness and warmth influence him, but of course, when he wanted it to, it didn't do anything. I'm happy you decided that we could have this talk. Whiskey continued on gently, not wanting to scare off the youngest of the trio any more than she already was. Luffy continued shifting and fidgeting, not looking up from the deck that he had been staring at the entire time. Wanted help, Luffy said shortly. Any signs of his happy demeanor that had been showing through lately were completely gone, showing only the scared timid boy that he had been ever since the facility. And I intend to give you that help. I know it's hard, and maybe even a little scary to talk to me. I understand, so don't worry, I don't mind. Whiskey said, and Luffy looked up just enough to see her give him a playful wink, a smile still on her face, and only happy, calm feelings coming from her. It eased him, but only slightly. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to. Anything I ask is only meant for me to help you better in the long run, but if you don't like something that I ask, you can just tell me pass, and I won't ask about it again unless you bring it up. Sound good? Whiskey asked. Luffy thought about it, wondering if all good nurses were like this. He still didn't have much experience with good nurses, only Whiskey, and she always made sure the brothers knew what she was doing before she did it. She gave them freedom, and it contradicted everything Luffy had grown up seeing nurses and doctors do. MHM. Luffy hummed in agreement, calming down further at the freedom of choice. If you have any questions at all, you can ask them. I'll answer all of them to the best of my abilities. Whiskey continued explaining. By now, Luffy's fidgeting had died down completely to the point that he was only shuffling around every few minutes rather than constantly. Okay, Luffy said, continuing to keep his responses short and quiet. Even though he was slightly more comfortable around Whiskey now compared to when he first met her, it was still hard for him to let go of that fear that clung to him, telling him nurses and doctors were bad. Horrible people that didn't care about you, your feelings, or whether you were in pain or not. I'll start off easy, just a simple yes or no. After everything you've gone through, would you say you've changed compared to how you used to be before everything with the facility happened? Maybe you act different, or think differently than you used to. Whiskey asked, her tone becoming even softer and gentler than before at the sensitive topic. Luffy flinched at the mention of the facility, but nodded. He knew he had changed, it was obvious he had, and it made him hate the facility even more for being able to have that effect on him. He just wanted to be the way he used to be, but that seemed like an impossibility now after everything he'd been through. Yeah, Luffy said, earning a nod from Whiskey as she started writing more notes down. And do you like the changes? Whiskey asked, making Luffy frown a bit. No? He said firmly, the answer coming easy to him. What's something you'd want to change? The nurse asked, making him think. He never really thought about anything specific before, he just knew he wanted to change, wanted to go back to normal. I want to stop being scared, and I want to stop having nightmares. I don't like being scared all the time. Luffy said, his voice small and timid again, practically shrinking in on himself as he looked at the deck again, rather than the nurse. Is there anything in particular that makes you scared? I know you don't like nurses, but is it or are there other things you're scared of? Whiskey asked, and Luffy thought about whether he wanted to answer the heavy question. I get scared of strangers, and people with bad feelings, and I'm scared of being alone. Luffy said, listing the things he knew he was scared of. And your nightmares, do you have them often? Whiskey asked, having a feeling she knew the answer already after having spoken to Ace and Sabo. Luffy hummed, nodding instead of speaking. How often? Every day. She asked, trying to make it easier on the clearly terrified and nervous teen. He hummed again, still not looking up from the deck. How often would you rather have them? She asked, and it took Luffy a minute to register the question. I don't know, not every day. Luffy said with a shrug, not really minding as long as they didn't wake him and his brothers up every night. He always felt guilty when he woke Sabo up, knowing his brother was probably more exhausted than he was. It was quite a moment while Whiskey continued writing something, but eventually, she stopped, putting the notebook down and smiling to Luffy. Well, I think that's all for now. She said, surprising Luffy, expecting something else to happen, expecting to have not liked the talk with the nurse, but he found that it hadn't been all that bad. Really? He asked a bit hesitantly, trying to remind himself that Whiskey herself had said that he could ask questions if he wanted to. That's right. This was only the first session, so we're still getting to know each other. If you want to continue these sessions, we'll probably talk longer than we did today. She said, standing and stretching. Luffy stood with her, glancing over to his brothers whose backs were to him as they watched everyone on the lower deck. Why don't we go tell them you're done, She asked good-naturedly, and Luffy dared to give her a bit of a smile, nodding before they began walking over to the two. Oh, you done, Lou? Ace asked, Luffy noticing that Sabo had tapped that he heard them coming. Luffy hummed with a bigger smile than before, happy to be back near his brothers. It wasn't too bad, was it? Sabo asked, ruffling his little brother's hair, his usual straw hat resting against his back, thanks to the string around his neck. Nope. Luffy said, easily finding his way in between his brothers as usual, while they all turned to look at Whiskey. In that case, we're all done for today. As I told you all earlier, this session was shorter due to it being the first one. If you three decide you want to continue this, we can. The sessions would probably be around 30 minutes to an hour each, and we'll have them twice a week if possible. The nurse explained, notebook and pencil held close to her side. Thank you again, Whiskey, we appreciate this, Sabo said, to which the nurse waved it off. Believe me, I just want to help in any way I can. If you find you do want to continue, just come by and tell me and I can tell you when our next session can be. It was nice talking to you, she said, waving to them as she began walking off. The brothers waved back until they couldn't see her anymore before collectively sighing. That sure was an experience, Ace said, rolling his shoulders to get rid of any lasting tension. You can say that again, Sabo said, thinking back to his own conversation with the nurse. Even though he easily could have, he hadn't listened in on Luffy and Ace's conversations, locking them out the best he could by focusing more on the loud boisterous pirates of the crew they had decided to join. You guys done? Haruta asked, walking up to them. Above them, there was a flash of blue, and they watched as Marco turned from a flaming bird into a human, landing softly beside the commander. We are. Thank you for helping us out, Sabo said, still amazed by the fruit Marco had. He only knew he had one, and what kind it was because he'd heard Luffy ramble on about the blue flames he'd used when he helped rescue them. The similarities between the commander's flames and his brother's made Luffy curious about what fruit he had, and had asked once during dinner, to which Marco explained he had a mythical zone fruit, the Phoenix. It was no problem, Yuri. We didn't mind helping out, Marco said smoothly, voice as calm and even as ever, his bored look ever present on his face. Yeah, trust me, watching for eavesdroppers was way better than hearing Thatch moan about how he couldn't enjoy the festival yesterday because he was busy, Haruta said with an eye roll. Sabo smiled, hearing the man himself whining in the kitchen to one of the other cooks. It had actually been the thing he'd used to distract himself from Ace and Luffy's talks the most. I know, I've been listening ever since I finished my talk. He's still going on about it, Sabo said, laughing lightly at Haruta's overdramatic groan. No? Marco, give me something else to do. Tell me I have to go do some important work. Please. Haruta practically begged, this time making the first commander roll his eyes. You don't need me to tell you about all that paperwork you haven't done, Yuri, Marco said, making the other commander perk up in glee. Yes, you're right. Thanks, Marco, see you guys around, Haruta said before spinning on his heels and nearly running towards his room, ignoring the strange looks he got for it. I feel like this is a recurring thing, Ace said with a raised eyebrow, watching the commander run. He laughed as he saw him nearly fall after he tripped over his feet. Sadly, nearly everyone on this ship can be a bit overdramatic at times, Marco said, shaking his head and crossing his arms. Surely you don't mean me as well, my dear brother, Izo said as he walked up to the group, a smile on his face, though his eyes screamed that he was ready to attack Marco for his comment. Of course not Izo, Yuri, Marco said, not turning to look at his ship brother, smiling to the brothers who smiled back. This made Izo frown and huff, but he didn't seem to take too much offense to the words, instead turning his attention to the brothers. So you're done talking to Whiskey? He asked, all of them nodding. Yup. Whiskey wasn't mean to me at all either, she was really nice. Luffy chirped happily, pleased with how his talk had gone, even if he had felt pretty scared and nervous throughout the whole thing. Well, that's good. I wouldn't expect anything less of one of our best nurses, Izo said pleasantly, smiling to Luffy who continued beaming back. Beside him, Sabo's eyes drifted towards the galley door, a hint of a smile ghosting upon his face. I think you may want to go hide Izo. Thatch is coming to find you so he can complain about his lack of adventure on the island yesterday, Sabo said, hearing the man tell the poor chef he'd been complaining to just that, his footsteps heading straight to the door. Of course he is. Well, it was nice speaking to you three, Izo said with a wave to them, and Marco didn't miss that he completely ignored him, probably still a bit angry about his earlier comment. That was fine, he would get over it before lunch like he always did. We better go too, I'd rather not listen to even more of his complaining if I can help it, Sabo said to Marco who nodded in agreement. I'm taking everyone else's let and locking myself in my room, Marco said, the four of them all beginning a fast-paced walk to their rooms. They said their goodbyes in the hall, all slipping silently into their rooms. Sabo didn't miss the sounds of Thatch leaving the galley, wreaking havoc to those on deck, as he searched for anyone to listen to his woes. Sabo couldn't help but laugh when he heard him complain that he couldn't find anyone. Anyway, that's all for now. If you enjoyed this, comment down below. Can we get much higher? Peace out.